A cold-hearted billionaire who never believed in love until a rainy night brought someone into his life. He never expected his destiny to change forever. Hello, viewer. Thanks for joining us. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. Alexander Blackwood stood by the massive windows of his office, his gaze fixed on the sprawling Manhattan skyline. Late afternoon sunlight filtered through, painting tall glass buildings in bronze hues. At 35, he had already built Blackwood Industries into a financial empire. His imposing height and sharply tailored charcoal suit commanded respect, but it was his demeanor, cool and impenetrable, that made his board members tread carefully around him. Grey eyes that never seemed to betray any warmth added to the atmosphere of distant authority. Outside his office, nervous assistants bustled about. They exchanged anxious glances, cautious to keep their voices low whenever they discussed the next meeting or the next deal. Nothing could be left to chance. Alexander Blackwood demanded perfection and left no room for mistakes. Yet beneath this carefully maintained facade, a faint current of restlessness stirred. He seldom acknowledged it, but in the rare moments when he stood alone against the skyline, he felt its subtle presence. An alert chimed on his phone, announcing the arrival of Leonard Hughes, his trusted financial advisor and oldest colleague at the firm. Leonard, a man in his early 40s with kind eyes, stepped into the room. "Afternoon, Mr. Blackwood," Leonard said, his tone professionally measured. "I've got the quarterly reports you asked for." Alexander turned, arms folded across his chest. "Set them down," he replied, voice curt yet calm. "I'll look them over tonight." Leonard placed a folder on the immaculate glass desk. "These figures are strong, but I should mention something else, our reputation outside the corporate world. We've been invited to a charity art event next week. It could improve public perception." Alexander's expression hardened. He had spent years carefully separating his business dealings from what he called sentimental distractions. Charity galas were not his style. He disliked the forced small talk, the idle chatter about personal lives. "I appreciate the notice," he said, "but you know my policy on public events. I see no direct benefit in me attending." Leonard nodded, though he recognized the flicker of fatigue behind Alexander's stern eyes. "Understood. We can discuss it another time if you wish." As Leonard departed, Alexander stepped back to the window. He recalled an image from his past, his father teaching him that success was born from ruthless focus. Emotions, the elder Blackwood had insisted, only got in the way. Those lessons shaped Alexander's outlook on life. If he felt an instinctive draw toward anything personal, he quickly subdued it, wrapping it in layers of cold resolve. He thought of his solitary apartment, perched high in a luxury building on the Upper West Side. It contained expensive furniture, hand-picked works of art, and gleaming marble floors. Yet it felt vacant, a place he returned to simply to rest before the next onslaught of business demands. He rarely had visitors, and he preferred it that way. A sudden knock at the door broke his train of thought. His executive assistant, a composed woman named Meredith, peeked in. "Mr. Blackwood, the board members are waiting in the conference room for the final budget review." Alexander glanced at the watch on his wrist. "I'm on my way." He straightened his tie and strode out with confidence. In the boardroom, he delivered numbers, projections, and strategies with precision. The board, a collection of seasoned investors and executives, listened intently. Despite their admiration for his vision, there was always a careful distance in their voices. No one dared to delve beyond the realms of balance sheets and profit margins. When the meeting ended, only one person lingered. Janet Caldwell, a senior board member known for her candidness, approached Alexander. She had been an associate of his father, and despite her advanced age, her mind was still sharp as ever. "You've done well, Alexander," she said softly, "but I worry you might be burning the candle at both ends. Letting yourself breathe every once in a while might do you some good." He offered a taut, polite smile. "Thank you for your concern, Janet. I'm exactly where I want to be." Her expression held a trace of pity. "So it seems," she replied. Then she slipped out of the room, leaving him standing there in thoughtful silence. Alexander returned to his office, the city still gleaming in the early evening light. The door closed behind him with a soft click. He placed a hand against the smooth surface of the window, letting the hum of Manhattan's traffic lull him into a momentary daze. He had no intention of becoming emotionally vulnerable. Every relationship he had ever observed, whether among friends or business partners, seemed to crumble under the weight of expectation. He preferred control, and that meant never giving anyone the slightest opening into his personal life. He checked his phone. A single missed call from his Aunt Helena in Connecticut. She was the last relative he spoke to with any regularity. The call went unanswered, as usual. Alexander quietly promised himself he would return it later, but deep down, he knew he might let it slip once again. A slight ache touched his chest, though he resisted its pull. He glanced at the folder on his desk, bracing for another night of reports and figures, well aware that somewhere inside a question was forming, one he swiftly pushed away. A mild drizzle turned into a sudden downpour just as Alexander stepped outside the gleaming Blackwood Industries building. It had been a draining day, filled with negotiations, and he planned to walk for a few minutes to clear his head before heading home. Manhattan's sidewalks were slick, causing pedestrians to rush for shelter under awnings and bus stops. Alexander was in no particular hurry, despite the sheets of rain sliding off his expensive overcoat. He rarely allowed inconvenience to rattle him. Instead, he strolled on with quiet determination, ignoring the curious looks from people who recognized him. Umbrellas popped open around him in every direction, forming a colorful canopy along the busy street. Suddenly, he spotted a frazzled figure across the road. A young woman was scrambling to gather several large canvases, each partially wrapped in plastic. The fierce rain battered her efforts, threatening to ruin the vivid paintings he could see peeking out from beneath the covers. She had flaming red hair plastered to her cheeks and neck, and her clothes were drenched. Despite the chaos, she seemed more concerned about saving her artwork than about her own discomfort. Without fully understanding why, Alexander found himself crossing the street. Cars honked and water splashed up from the curb, soaking the legs of his tailored pants. He grimaced but continued forward. He finally reached the woman who had her back against the wall of a closed cafe, desperately trying to keep the canvases from toppling onto the wet sidewalk. "Here," he said abruptly, holding out his umbrella. The words sounded rough and unfamiliar on his tongue. He almost never offered unsolicited help, especially to strangers. "You can shelter the paintings with this." The woman looked up, startled. Her green eyes widened, reflecting a mix of relief and embarrassment. "Thank you," she managed, her voice shaky from the cold. "I can't believe I got caught in this weather." Alexander stepped closer, carefully positioning the umbrella over the largest canvas. Raindrops trickled along the edges and onto his expensive shoes, but he ignored them. "Why don't you move them under that awning?" he suggested, pointing toward a small bookstore a few doors down that offered better cover. She nodded, struggling to lift the paintings, which appeared heavier than he'd first assumed. He swiftly took 2 of the canvases from her arms and began walking toward the bookstore. Her cheeks flushed, possibly from the combination of chill and surprise. Once they were safely settled under the awning's dry patch, he handed her the umbrella. Her voice trembled in gratitude. "I'm so sorry to drag you into this. I'm Olivia Foster." Alexander simply responded, "Alexander?" as he studied her face. Water dripped off the tip of her nose, and her eyes sparkled with a kind of resilient spirit he was unaccustomed to seeing. She glanced at the drenched canvases, wincing at the damage. "These pieces are for an upcoming gallery exhibition. It's a local show, but it's important. I can't afford to have them ruined." He noticed the vibrant brushstrokes, reflecting city scenes and fleeting human expressions, something raw and emotional. "Do you live far?" he asked, clearing his throat when he realized how gruff he sounded. She brushed a damp lock of hair behind her ear. "Not too far, but it feels like miles in this storm. I was trying to hail a cab, but everyone's rushing to find one." He eyed the paintings, then the woman's soaked clothes. Beneath the well-constructed walls of his reserved personality, something nudged at him, an urge to help. "I can call a car service. Let them drive you and your canvases home." "Oh, that's very kind, but I don't want to trouble you," she began, though her voice betrayed relief. "It's not trouble," he said, pulling out his phone. "Just wait here." A few swift taps, and within minutes, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb. "Go ahead, I'll help you load these." She nodded, grateful and somewhat astonished. Together, they carefully placed the canvases inside. When she finally climbed in, she hesitated before shutting the door. "Alexander," she said softly, "I really don't know how to thank you." He offered a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Just take care of your work. It looks significant." His words sounded strange to his own ears, as if he wasn't fully in control of them. The driver pulled away, leaving him standing in the drizzle. He realized his coat was thoroughly soaked, his neatly combed hair plastered to his forehead. Yet for a moment, none of that mattered. He lingered under the awning, experiencing a subtle, disconcerting warmth in his chest. He turned and walked into the rain again, continuing toward his building. The city lights blurred in the downpour, reflecting in shallow puddles along the street. All the while, his mind kept returning to the flicker of gratitude in Olivia Foster's green eyes. The fleeting encounter unsettled him in a way no business deal ever had. He reached his front lobby, water dripping off him in rivulets, and paused. Outside, thunder rolled across the darkened sky, and he felt an odd sense that the world around him was shifting, whether he willed it or not. Night had fallen by the time Alexander stepped through the door of his penthouse on the Upper West Side. His reflection flickered across the polished marble floor as he flicked on the lights. The spacious interior greeted him with its usual hush, pristine furniture, modern art pieces carefully arranged, and windows offering a panoramic view of the city lights. Yet the silence felt heavier than usual. Alexander removed his soaked overcoat, draping it across a nearby chair. Normally, he would have methodically dried it and sent it out for cleaning the next day. Tonight, however, the routine slipped his mind. He walked to the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, and poured himself a glass of water. While he usually avoided letting his thoughts wander, he couldn't stop replaying the scene of Olivia Foster struggling with her paintings. The memory of her damp hair and determined eyes seemed etched in his mind. He set the glass down and braced his palms against the cool countertop. What was it about her that lingered so vividly? He had encountered countless people under all sorts of circumstances, business partners, socialites, even acquaintances at charity events. Yet rarely had anyone made him pause, let alone compelled him to offer unsolicited help. Whatever had happened tonight had breached his carefully maintained defenses. His phone vibrated, drawing his attention away from his thoughts. He picked it up to see a missed call from his aunt, Helena. He found himself torn between ignoring it and calling her back. Normally, the decision was simple. He kept personal conversations to a minimum. But an inkling of guilt nudged him to dial her number. "Alex," Helena answered almost immediately, her tone a mixture of relief and mild reproach. I was worried. It's late. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I've been busy. Board meetings. Reports. You know how it is. I do, but you still need to make time for yourself, she said, her voice gentle. Are you eating properly? Getting enough rest? His gaze wandered to the untouched bag of takeout he'd brought home. I manage. She paused for a moment. We haven't spoken much lately. Has anything changed on your end? Alexander thought about the storm, the drenched artist, the way his heart had unexpectedly stirred. He weighed his words carefully. No major changes, he lied, voice steady. Just business as usual. Well, that's something, I suppose. Your father was always chasing the next deal too, Helena said with a sigh. Sometimes I wish he hadn't taught you to bury your feelings as deeply as he did. Alexander stiffened. I don't bury anything. I focus. A short silence followed. Helena's voice grew quieter. I only hope you'll find a reason to let someone in someday. You deserve more than just numbers and figures. He offered a perfunctory goodbye, promising to call again soon. After ending the call, he wandered to the living room, gazing at the city below. The conversation with Helena had unearthed a stream of memories he preferred to keep locked away. In the dim light, he imagined he could see his younger self, lonely nights studying by a flickering lamp while other children played in the street outside. His father's voice echoed in his mind, warning that any sign of weakness would inevitably be exploited by others. Over time, Alexander had come to believe that forming emotional attachments was not only distracting, but also dangerous. He sank into the leather sofa, still unable to shake the image of Olivia. She had seemed genuinely thankful, yet unafraid to show her vulnerability. That juxtaposition was rare in his world, where any sign of weakness was met with judgment or disapproval. He began to wonder if vulnerability could be a source of strength rather than a flaw. A soft beep from his phone indicated an incoming message. Glancing at the screen, he saw a notification from Leonard Hughes, a reminder that the annual philanthropic report was due soon, along with an invitation to an upcoming charity art event in Brooklyn. He had brushed off such events countless times, but now it stood out, resonating strangely with what he'd witnessed in the rain. Could Olivia Foster be one of the artists featured? He had never bothered to check the names of participants in those smaller exhibitions. Suddenly, he felt a wave of curiosity. It was unsettling to realize he might actually consider attending. He rose from the sofa, tension building in his chest. The part of him that thrived on control insisted that tonight's encounter meant nothing and that he should discard any further thought about it. Yet another part questioned whether his life might hold more than boardrooms and annual reports. Without arriving at a clear answer, he moved to the bedroom, telling himself to bury the moment as he always did with anything that threatened his carefully guarded composure. He switched off the lights and closed the door on the silent penthouse, forcing himself into a restless sleep. But even in the quiet dark, a fragment of Olivia's face lingered, a reminder that for the first time in a long while, something had penetrated the armor he wore so persistently. Morning arrived with a bright, cloudless sky, as if the storm had never taken place. Yet Alexander felt a lingering sense of disquiet from the previous evening's events. He sat at his desk at Blackwood Industries, staring at lines of financial data that should have commanded his full attention. He tried to refocus, but found it irritatingly difficult. A tap on his doorframe made him look up. Leonard Hughes stepped in, offering a polite nod. "I've got some updates," he began. "First, we finalized the European merger you were after. Second, the local arts community is organizing a charity auction in Brooklyn next week. They're hoping we'll sponsor a portion of the event." Alexander glanced down at a set of documents on his desk to hide the flicker of interest in his eyes. "Who's behind this auction? Is it a major gallery?" Leonard shook his head. "Not exactly. It's a collaboration between smaller galleries and local artists. The organizer, a woman named Alice Morgan, is reaching out to various philanthropists. There's also an emerging artist named Olivia Foster featured in one of the promotional flyers I received. I recall that name being mentioned somewhere, so I thought you might want to know. Alexander felt his pulse quicken, a sensation he wasn't accustomed to acknowledging. "I see," he said, keeping his tone level. "Do we have any formal invitation?" "Yes, it's in your inbox. No pressure, of course. But these types of events can be good for our image. Corporate social responsibility, you know," Leonard added with a small smile. "I'll consider it," Alexander replied. "Thank you, Leonard." Once alone, he opened his email and found the invitation. Sure enough, the flyer listed Olivia Foster among other up-and-coming artists. A swirl of thoughts filled his mind. The memory of her standing in the downpour, the relief in her eyes when he helped her. Part of him felt a pull to see her artwork in a proper setting, to discover how her passion translated onto the canvas without the threat of a thunderstorm hanging overhead. Yet another part of him balked. He had spent decades avoiding situations that might lead him to emotional entanglements. He told himself that attending a small art auction was a trivial matter, but it didn't feel trivial. It felt like a decision that could nudge open a door he'd long kept shut. His internal battle was interrupted by the sharp ring of his office phone. On the other end was Helena, his aunt. She rarely called the direct line at his office, which signaled some urgency. He took a deep breath before answering. "Alex," Helena said, her tone brisk. "I know it's the middle of your workday, but I have news. I was invited to the same Brooklyn art charity. Apparently, my name was dropped by some local organizer who knows I've supported youth arts in the past." Alexander leaned back in his chair. "That's surprising. Why call me about it?" Helena chuckled softly. "I wanted to see if you had any interest in going. Sometimes you'd rather jump off a cliff than attend these things, but I thought I'd ask." He paused. "I've received an invitation as well." Her voice brightened. "Then perhaps we could attend together. You could show the world that the Blackwood family isn't just about business acquisitions." His jaw clenched reflexively. "It's not high on my priority list, but I'm considering it." She let a comfortable silence settle between them. "Sometimes it helps to step out of our routine. You never know what you might find when you do." He ended the call, thoughtful. Helena's timing was uncanny. He wondered if, beneath her carefully chosen words, she was nudging him toward experiences that might thaw his guarded heart. He returned to the flyer on his screen, his gaze settling on Olivia Foster's name once more. A knock at the door startled him. Meredith, his executive assistant, walked in with a tight-lipped efficiency. "Mr. Blackwood, there's an issue with the new corporate housing proposal. The CFO wants an immediate meeting." Alexander stood, slipping his phone into his pocket. "I'll deal with it now." He followed her down the hallway, crossing a line of glass-walled conference rooms. The demands of running a massive corporation usually consumed him completely, leaving no room for personal reflection. But today, each step felt slightly heavier. His mind kept drifting to the idea of attending an event where he would see Olivia again. Throughout the meeting, he found his focus faltering. He delivered the usual firm decisions and instructions, yet an undercurrent of distraction ran through his every word. Normally, this would have alarmed him, but he couldn't deny a sense of anticipation forming in the back of his mind. After the meeting concluded, Leonard caught him by the elbow. "Are you sure you're all right?" he asked, lowering his voice. "You seem distant." Alexander drew in a measured breath. "I'm fine, Leonard. There's just a lot to consider, that's all." Without further explanation, he retreated to his office, shut the door, and sat down at his desk. The invitation to the art event glowed on his computer screen, practically daring him to break his usual pattern. He tapped his fingers on the desk, feeling torn between the comfortable familiarity of isolation and the faint promise of something new that he couldn't quite put into words. Alexander paced the length of his office, checking his watch every few minutes. He had a call scheduled with a group of European investors in 15 minutes. But his mind was not on currency rates or shareholder demands. Instead, it circled around a simple decision: whether to accept the art charity invitation. He stopped pacing when his phone rang, expecting his overseas contacts. Instead, the screen showed a number he didn't recognize. Cautiously, he answered. Alexander Blackwood. Mr. Blackwood, hello, my name is Alice Morgan. I'm one of the organizers for the Brookside Art Benefit in Brooklyn, an upbeat female voice chirped. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. He cleared his throat. I have a few minutes. Go ahead. Well, first, I want to thank you for considering our invitation. Your company's reputation for supporting community projects has grown, especially since you launched that small art sponsorship program last year. She paused, waiting for a response that didn't come. Anyway, I just wanted to personally extend an invitation. We'd be thrilled to have someone of your stature in attendance. We believe it would help shine a spotlight on the talented artists we're featuring, including Olivia Foster. His grip on the phone tightened slightly at Olivia's name. I see. And what would my role be at this event? We'd like to have you give a short welcome speech, perhaps mention why you feel the arts are important. Nothing too formal, just a few words for the audience, Alice explained. We'd keep it brief, and afterward, you'd be free to explore the exhibits or simply mingle. We've heard wonderful things about your philanthropic side. Alexander suppressed a sardonic smile. His philanthropic side had been more of a strategic move than a heartfelt endeavor. Still, the memory of Olivia huddled in the rain cut through his usual cynicism. I'm considering it. Alice's tone brightened. Fantastic. No pressure, of course, but if you decide to attend, please let me know as soon as you can. We'll have everything arranged, and I'm sure Olivia would be delighted to see you there. She was telling me about how kind you were when you helped her in that downpour. Alexander felt the flicker of warmth return, though he kept his voice steady. I appreciate the call, Miss Morgan. I'll be in touch soon. He ended the call and exhaled deeply. For years, he had steered clear of anything resembling a personal invitation, yet now it confronted him head-on. He glanced at the framed photo on his desk, a rare image of him and his Aunt Helena at a Blackwood Industries groundbreaking ceremony. Though he never admitted it out loud, Helena's belief that he needed to open up always resonated somewhere in the back of his mind. His phone rang again, interrupting his thoughts. This time, it was indeed the European investors. He switched gears seamlessly, presenting polished projections and unwavering confidence. Yet behind his perfectly timed statements about mergers and capital expansions, his mind kept drifting to the idea of stepping into that art gallery, an entirely different sphere from the business strongholds he knew so well. After the call, Leonard Hughes entered the office with a file in hand. That was a solid meeting, Leonard said, placing the file on Alexander's desk. Also, I saw Alice Morgan's number on the call log. She's been trying to reach you for days. Alexander nodded. She finally got hold of me today, invited me to speak at that art benefit. Leonard tilted his head. Surprised you took the call. So, are you going? Alexander hesitated, leaning back in his chair. I've never cared for these functions, but I might, he conceded. It could be useful to maintain goodwill. And besides, He caught himself before mentioning Olivia. There's a reason to think it could be good PR. A knowing look flickered across Leonard's face, but he offered no comment. Instead, he said, Let me know if you need anything prepared, speaking points or a press release. I'll be glad to help. When Leonard left, Alexander opened his laptop and scrolled through photos from last year's event. Joyful faces, colorful backdrops, and energetic performances filled the screen. It was a stark contrast to the stuffy black-tie galas he usually attended out of obligation. These pictures depicted ordinary people enthralled by creativity, not networking or power plays. He saw a snapshot of Olivia's exhibit, a small corner featuring bright, emotive paintings. Some captured everyday street scenes, others revealed stormy landscapes. He recognized her style from the glimpses he'd caught the night before. A wave of curiosity washed over him. What fueled her passion? How did she funnel her emotions into art so freely when he had spent a lifetime locking them away? His thoughts were interrupted by another reminder blinking on his computer. More meetings, more deadlines. He closed the browser, pushing aside a tinge of excitement, or was it apprehension? He told himself he hadn't made a decision yet the faint stirring in his chest suggested otherwise. Outside, the sun had drifted behind the skyscrapers, casting long shadows across his office floor. He gathered his things, aware that he had to finalize a choice soon. Attending the benefit might open a door he had stubbornly kept shut for years. Yet in the quiet hum of his spacious office, he felt that doing so might be the only way to stop a growing restlessness he could no longer ignore. Alexander stood at the edge of his private helipad, the blades of his company helicopter slicing the crisp Connecticut air. He had made a rare decision to leave Manhattan during a work week and travel to his Aunt Helena's sprawling estate. The flight had taken less than an hour, but it felt as though he'd crossed into a different world. Rolling hills and autumn-colored trees stretched in every direction, a stark contrast to the steel skyline he was used to. When he arrived, a housekeeper led him through the foyer into a sunlit sitting room. Helena Blackwood, a dignified woman in her early 60s, rose from an antique armchair. Her silver hair framed a warm but discerning face. She wore a navy cardigan and slacks, an outfit that struck a balance between casual comfort and refined elegance. Despite her sophistication, there was always genuine warmth in her eyes whenever Alexander appeared. She moved forward and surprised him with a quick, affectionate embrace. "You must be famished, Alex. I had the kitchen prepare something simple. I know how you dislike fuss." He nodded, uncharacteristically relieved to be out of the city's commotion. "Thank you, Aunt Helena. I appreciate it." They walked to a smaller dining room overlooking a picturesque garden. The table held a spread of sandwiches, fruit, and tea, which Helena began serving without ceremony. Alexander joined her at the table, sipping tea as he tried to gather his thoughts. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence, however, felt comforting rather than stiff. Finally, Helena fixed him with a penetrating gaze. "Your assistant told me you rearranged your schedule to come here. I'm curious what's on your mind." Alexander straightened in his chair, feeling an unusual tension in his shoulders. "I'm considering attending an art benefit in Brooklyn," he began, choosing his words carefully. "It's a smaller event, but they asked me to speak, and you mentioned you'd been invited too." Helena set her teacup down, the faint rattle of porcelain punctuating the otherwise quiet room. "Yes, I received that invitation as well. I've been involved with youth arts programs in Connecticut for years. They must have reached out hoping I could bring some attention to their cause." He stared at his own reflection in the polished silver of a serving tray. "I've never really cared for these events. Charity, philanthropy, cultural gatherings, they usually serve as networking tools for me, if I participate at all. But this time, there's a particular artist I met, purely by chance. She left an impression." Helena's eyes sparkled with curiosity. "An impression, you say?" He cleared his throat. "I met her one rainy night in Manhattan. She was struggling with her paintings, caught in the storm." He paused, recalling Olivia's earnest expression. "I couldn't just walk past," Helena listened intently, her features softening into a thoughtful smile. So you helped her. That's more than I'd expect from my nephew who insists compassion is a liability. Alexander let out a quiet breath. I'm not sure what overcame me. It felt wrong to ignore her. And now I find myself thinking of her art show, wondering if I should attend. His aunt pressed a palm gently on the back of his hand. I know how your father taught you to handle the world, always braced for battle, never letting anyone breach your defenses. But sometimes, life has a way of showing us a different path. You might discover a world beyond mere profit, Alex. He leaned back, folding his arms in a gesture that still retained traces of his habitual reserve. I'm well aware of my father's lessons. They've served me in building Blackwood Industries. Emotions and attachments complicate deals, so I've tried to avoid them. But something about this woman's determination, it made me pause. Helena's gaze darted toward the open French doors leading to the garden. You know, when I first took you in after your parents passed, I worried you would become cold and closed off. To some extent, you did, but I believe there's more heart in you than you realize. Perhaps this event is your chance to explore that side without feeling threatened. A gentle breeze wafted into the room, carrying the scent of pine. Alexander shifted, unsettled by the vulnerability creeping into his thoughts. Are you suggesting I just throw caution to the wind and dive into uncharted waters? I'm suggesting you consider that your life might be fuller if you allow a little risk, Helena said. Whether it's about art, friendship, or dare I say love, these are things that can enrich you more than any business acquisition. You're not the ruthless machine you pretend to be. He didn't protest, though a part of him recoiled from the very word love. Instead, he nodded slowly. I understand. They finished their tea, discussing lighter topics for a while. Helena's philanthropic efforts, the progress of an after-school art program she supported, and her plans to visit Manhattan more often. But the undercurrent of their conversation lingered, a sense that Alexander stood at a threshold, unsure whether to step forward or retreat. As twilight approached, Alexander said his goodbyes, promising to let Helena know if he would indeed attend the benefit. She walked him to the door, a gentle smile at her lips. Remember, not everything needs to be calculated down to the last decimal. Sometimes it's enough to follow a stir in your heart. He managed a faint smile in return. Outside, the helicopter blades kicked up a whirlwind of fallen leaves as he ascended into the dusky sky. The estate quickly shrank below him, yet the words of his aunt resonated. For the first time in a very long while, he was open to the possibility that life held something beyond his carefully guarded empire. Alexander returned to Manhattan and resumed his usual routine. Back-to-back meetings, rapid-fire phone calls, and meticulous review of financial reports. Yet a subtle shift had taken place. The conversation with Helena lingered like an echo in his mind. He found himself pausing at times, wondering if there was more to his life than these endless metrics of success. A day before the Brooklyn Art Benefit, Leonard Hughes stepped into his office with a cautious smile. Mr. Blackwood, I wanted to finalize the preparations for tomorrow. Will you be attending the art charity? Alexander took a measured breath. Yes. Make the necessary arrangements. I'll give a short speech. Keep it concise. Leonard's eyebrows lifted in pleasant surprise. Of course, I'll handle the press brief. They're expecting a statement about our art sponsorship. Alexander nodded, handing him a neatly typed card. My remarks, if you can have them printed. Leonard glanced at the document, scanning a few lines. It's short. Indeed. He hesitated, a hint of a grin forming. You're sure this is all you'd like to say? That's enough, Alexander replied, closing the conversation. Inside, he felt a flutter of nerves, though he refused to show it. By the following afternoon, Manhattan's brisk pace carried on as usual. Yet Alexander felt like an outsider in his own city. He left work early, an occurrence so rare that employees exchanged puzzled glances. His driver navigated the congested streets, eventually crossing the bridge into Brooklyn. The landscape changed from skyscrapers and polished storefronts to graffiti-adorned walls, indie cafes, and eclectic galleries. It was a world away from the marble corridors of Blackwood Industries. Stepping out of the car at the entrance of the modest art venue, he drew a deep breath. There was no plush red carpet, no line of paparazzi, just a few local journalists and a modest banner that read Brookside Art Benefit. He walked through the double doors, noticing how the interior buzzed with creative energy. Bright canvases hung from exposed brick walls, while clusters of visitors discussed the artwork in low, excited tones. A volunteer directed him to a small backstage area where he would wait before his speech. The route passed by rooms filled with paintings, sculptures, and multimedia exhibits. Snippets of conversation flitted around him, an older woman praising the vibrancy of a street scene, a younger couple marveling at an abstract sculpture of city lights. Soon, he found himself amid a small group of event organizers. Alice Morgan, a lively brunette in her early 30s, approached with a warm smile. "Mr. Blackwood, so glad you could make it. Everything's set for your remarks in about 15 minutes. We'll have you on the main stage, then you can mingle." He offered a curt but polite nod. "Thank you. And Ms. Foster, is she here?" Alice pointed across the room. "Olivia's arranging her display in the second gallery. She might be there if you want to say hello before you speak." The idea of seeking Olivia out felt both necessary and daunting. He excused himself, weaving through small gatherings of artists and patrons. The second gallery space was quieter. Evidently not as many people had ventured in yet. Bright overhead lamps illuminated paintings that ranged from reflective city scenes to more personal portraits. He found Olivia in the corner, carefully adjusting the positioning of a canvas. She wore a simple black dress, her red hair cascading over her shoulders. There was a subtle tension in her expression, the slight furrow of her brow suggesting worry about the final arrangement. Yet, even in that moment of concentration, her eyes sparkled with the same determination he'd witnessed in the storm. She turned, and her face lit up in an instant of recognition. "Alexander, I wasn't sure if you'd actually come." He stepped closer, noticing the vibrant colors of her newest painting, a scene depicting several silhouetted figures huddled under umbrellas in the rain. "I said I'd consider it. Here I am." A gentle laugh escaped her. "You showed up, so thank you. I appreciate anyone willing to support local artists, but you're not just anyone." He glanced around. "It's an impressive exhibit. Your piece here, it has a certain emotion to it." Olivia's eyes flitted to the painting, then back to him. "I was inspired by that night, actually. The night you helped me. I didn't mention it directly to Alice, but that was the event that sparked this. I wanted to capture the idea that sometimes a stranger can offer warmth in a cold world." Alexander felt a flicker of discomfort, unsure how to respond to this direct acknowledgement. "I'm glad it resulted in something meaningful." She tilted her head, studying him more closely. "Are you nervous about speaking? You look like a man who's used to giving orders, but maybe not personal speeches." He exhaled softly, conceding the truth with a small nod. "I address board members daily, but this is different. I'm stepping outside my usual realm." Before Olivia could reply, a voice called from the doorway, announcing that Alexander's segment was about to begin. He inclined his head in a brief nod, acknowledging he'd heard. Turning back to her, he added quietly, I'll do my best not to bore everyone. Save me some of your time afterward. I'd like to hear more about your work." A brief smile flickered across her face. "I'll be here." He made his way to the stage area, each step feeling like a symbolic departure from the life he'd always known. On the makeshift podium, under modest spotlights, he cleared his throat and scanned the modest crowd. It was time to speak, not only with logic and figures, but possibly with a part of himself he had rarely exposed. A scattered round of applause greeted Alexander as he walked onto the low-rise stage. The gallery's temporary lighting cast a warm glow against the brick walls, and guests hushed their conversations to focus on him. He glanced briefly at the typed speech Leonard had arranged and decided in a moment of spontaneity to set it aside. It felt too impersonal for what he intended to convey. He took a breath and began. "Good evening. My name is Alexander Blackwood, CEO of Blackwood Industries. I'm grateful for the chance to speak here tonight. This is not my usual environment. I'm used to boardrooms, spreadsheets, and profit margins." A small ripple of amusement passed through the crowd, easing the tension. "Yet, standing here among these works, I find a sense of vitality that I don't often experience in my day-to-day life." He paused, scanning the audience. In one corner, he saw Helena, who had quietly arrived. She gave him a reassuring nod. Across the room, near a pillar, he noticed Olivia, her green eyes following every word. In a city as vast as New York, it's easy to forget the importance of genuine human connection and creative expression, he continued. By supporting local artists, we aren't just funding pretty pictures, we're fueling voices that spark discussions about hope, struggle, and the human spirit. I believe that kind of discourse is essential. A ripple of applause broke out as he ended. It wasn't a thunderous ovation like one might hear at a political rally, but the warmth in the room was unmistakable. Stepping down from the stage, he felt an odd relief. He had spoken from a place more personal than he ever had in public, yet it felt strangely right. Alice Morgan bustled over. "That was wonderful. Thank you so much for coming and for speaking with such honesty." Alexander nodded, still a bit self-conscious. "I appreciate the opportunity." As the formal presentations concluded, music began to play softly. Guests dispersed among the exhibits, discussing the art with renewed enthusiasm. Alexander found himself meandering through the galleries, observing the interplay of colors and emotions captured on canvas. He exchanged a few polite words with attendees who recognized his name, but he kept his interactions brief, preferring solitude to process the unfamiliar sense of connection he felt. Soon he spotted Helena, who was admiring a set of portraits. "You did well," she said, greeting him with a gentle smile. "I'm proud of you." He managed a quiet laugh. "Let's see if the world doesn't collapse now that I've shown a hint of personal sentiment." Helena shook her head, her tone light. "I'd wager it'll keep on spinning. But you, my dear nephew, might notice it spinning in more vivid colors." They chatted a bit longer before Helena excused herself to mingle with some acquaintances. Alexander continued exploring alone until he returned to Olivia's section. She was busy speaking with a small group of admirers, describing her artistic process. As the onlookers moved on, she turned to him. "I caught your speech," she said. "It was refreshingly candid for a CEO." He raised an eyebrow. "I'm glad it wasn't too businesslike. This world is new to me." Olivia beckoned him closer to one of her newer paintings. It showed the Manhattan skyline at dusk, but instead of the usual hyper-realistic rendering, warm, swirling tones gave the city a dreamlike quality. "This piece is about seeing familiar spaces in a different light," she explained. "How a simple shift in perspective can transform the mundane into something almost magical." He studied the brushstrokes. noticing how each swirl seemed alive. "It's more emotive than I'm used to. I typically see the skyline as a place of opportunity and hard edges. That's just one interpretation," she replied. "Artists use light to reveal new truths or hide old ones. It's funny. Sometimes we hide what's most important in the shadows, even if we don't realize we're doing it." He wondered if that was aimed at him, but found he couldn't be defensive about it. Instead, he asked quietly, "When did you start painting?" Olivia folded her arms, reflecting. "Since I was a child, it was always my refuge. My parents moved around a lot, so I never really had a consistent place to call home. But painting became an anchor. It let me explore emotions without needing stability on the outside." Alexander felt the conversation nudging something in him, a distant memory of a father who never truly understood gentleness, a life shaped by relentless drive. Must be freeing. To pour your feelings onto a canvas like that, it can be terrifying, she admitted. You put yourself out there, and not everyone is kind. But if I don't create, I feel like I'm suffocating. He nodded thoughtfully, a flicker of admiration crossing his face. "I can see the courage in it." Olivia glanced around the gallery, which was filling with casual chatter, laughter, and the clink of wine glasses. "I'm glad you came tonight," she said, a gentle honesty in her voice. "I imagine it's far from your comfort zone, but I hope you'll stay a while." He gave a faint smile, surprising himself at how natural it felt. "I think I will." They began wandering through the space, side by side, exploring her work and those of other artists. A sense of cautious camaraderie settled between them, something built on mutual respect for each other's worlds. As more attendees drifted in, Alexander realized that stepping into this realm of color was more than just corporate philanthropy or a routine obligation. It was an opening, however subtle, into a broader human experience he'd scarcely allowed himself to acknowledge. As the evening progressed, the gallery grew livelier, the music more spirited. Alexander found himself immersed in an environment unlike anything he usually encountered. People openly discussed their passions, shared personal anecdotes, and even laughed at their own missteps in a way that was devoid of the power plays he was accustomed to. Here, vulnerability seemed acceptable, even encouraged. When he stepped outside for a moment of fresh air, a crisp breeze greeted him. The small courtyard behind the gallery was strung with fairy lights, creating a soft glow around a handful of attendees who drifted out for quiet conversation. A couple stood by a potted plant, their hands entwined, while an elderly gentleman puffed on a cigar near a discreet ashtray. Everything felt surprisingly relaxed. He leaned against the railing, thinking about how drastically his evening contrasted with his daily life. He didn't feel the usual tightening in his chest that came with closing a business deal or defending a corporate position. Instead, there was an odd sense of reprieve, like inhaling a deeper breath of oxygen after being in a cramped space. After a few minutes, Olivia joined him, a concerned expression on her face. "You disappeared. Everything okay?" He offered a half smile, surprised by the warmth in her tone. "Needed some air. It's a bit crowded in there." She nodded, stepping closer. "I get it. These events can be overwhelming. So many conversations, so many people." She looked around the softly lit courtyard. "But it's nice out here." He glanced at her, noticing how her hair caught the faint glow of the lights. "I never expected to feel comfortable in a place like this," he admitted. "I'm used to the polished veneer of corporate galas, where every smile hides an agenda." Olivia leaned her elbows on the railing. "This might sound strange, but I think there's a different kind of honesty in art circles. Even if people don't like each other's work, they're usually upfront about it." He laughed quietly, That level of honesty might startle some of my board members. They shared a moment of silent camaraderie. She pulled a thin cardigan tighter around her shoulders. "You know," she began, her gaze drifting up to the star-scattered sky, "I grew up always worrying about whether I'd have the resources to keep painting. My parents supported my passion in principle, but we had little stability. Now that I'm an adult, I still juggle part-time jobs to afford supplies. Even so, I can't imagine doing anything else." He admired her dedication. It contrasted sharply with his own life, built on unwavering practicality and a large fortune. "I've spent most of my years amassing wealth and influence," he said, "believing that would protect me from life's unpredictability. But for all my success, I'm still not certain it can shield me from everything." She studied his face. "It might protect you financially, but what about emotionally?" He stared at the dimly lit cobblestones underfoot, recalling countless evenings spent alone in his high-rise apartment. "I learned to distance myself. Emotions are complicated. I prefer things I can control." Olivia nodded, understanding. "I think many of us try to control what we can, but life has a way of surprising us, whether we resist or not." A soft piano melody from the gallery filtered into the courtyard. A few more guests wandered outside, dispersing to various corners. Neither Alexander nor Olivia felt compelled to move. The conversation was uncharted territory, yet also strangely grounding. Eventually, a staff member poked her head out. "Miss Foster, one of your buyers would love a word, if you have a moment." Olivia straightened. "Right, of course, thank you." She turned back to him. "Do you mind if I—" He waved a hand gently. "Go ahead. We'll talk later." As she went back inside, Alexander lingered a while longer, contemplating how seamlessly she navigated between her art and personal interactions. He recognized a sense of self-assurance in her, born not of arrogance, but of genuine passion and acceptance of uncertainty. Meanwhile, he had meticulously built walls around his life, operating under a belief that vulnerability was weakness. He exhaled, stepping away from the railing to head back indoors. A small voice in his mind whispered that the unpredictability he once feared might hold something valuable. That realization unsettled him, a ripple in the calm waters of his controlled world. Re-entering the main gallery, he noticed a mix of suits, bohemian clothing, and casual outfits, all merging in a whirl of conversation. People approached him occasionally to thank him for attending, and he responded politely. But in each exchange, his thoughts drifted to Olivia, to Helena's encouragement, and to the unforeseen paths that might open if he loosened his grip on rigid control. Somewhere near the entrance, a jazz trio started playing a soft tune. He stopped to listen, drawn by the gentle harmony. At that moment, he wondered if stepping into this unknown territory might be the turning point in a life he had so carefully orchestrated. The thought both intrigued and unnerved him, leaving him open to a new awareness of what might lie beyond the sheltered gates he'd built around his heart. A few days after the benefit, Alexander found himself with an unexpected invitation in hand. A small gathering of artists and supporters, organized by Alice Morgan, would meet to discuss future collaborations and funding. He typically would have delegated such an event to a junior executive or perhaps donated a sum without attending. But for reasons he couldn't quite articulate, he decided to go himself. The gathering took place in a quaint cafe in Brooklyn, its interior lined with bookshelves and local art. Soft jazz played from hidden speakers, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the scent of pastries. Unlike the formal boardrooms Alexander was used to, the cafe's casual ambiance encouraged relaxed conversation. He stepped inside and spotted Alice waving him over to a long wooden table. "Mr. Blackwood, so glad you could make it," she greeted, her smile genuine as she introduced him to the group. "We have a mix of artists, small business owners, and a few philanthropic individuals. Everyone is here to brainstorm." He glanced around, noticing a range of personalities: an older gentleman in paint-stained overalls, a middle-aged woman flipping through pages of her photography portfolio, a young sculptor with clay still caked beneath her fingernails. Amid them, Olivia sat sipping tea, catching his eye with a friendly nod. Once everyone settled, Alice explained the gathering's goal. "We want to create a more sustainable model for local artists and cultural events. Funding is part of it, but we also need to raise public awareness. It's not enough to rely on one annual benefit. We need ongoing engagement." Alexander listened intently. Typically, he would analyze the situation like a business pitch, focusing on potential returns or brand leverage. Yet the conversations here were about communal improvement, ideas on affordable studio spaces, workshops for aspiring artists, collaborative gallery nights. It struck him how these people saw value beyond the profit margin. They talked about inclusivity, about giving voice to underrepresented creators, about healing communities through art. At one point, Alice invited Alexander to speak. The group turned their attention to him, and he felt an uncharacteristic trace of nerves. He cleared his throat. "Blackwood Industries is open to exploring partnerships. In the past, we've sponsored educational programs in public schools, and we've donated to museum expansions. But I see potential in supporting grassroots movements like this one. Perhaps we can create a small fund dedicated to emerging artists. It would be a pilot program at first, but if successful, we could expand." A ripple of excitement passed around the table. The older gentleman in overalls, who introduced himself simply as Rico, leaned forward. "That's exactly what we need. If we had a modest fund to help with renting gallery space or buying supplies, we could host pop-up exhibitions more often." The conversation flowed in multiple directions. Some participants offered suggestions for how to structure the fund, while others discussed hosting community art fairs. Alexander took notes in a leather-bound planner, a gesture that surprised even himself. Usually, he had an assistant for that. But here, it felt necessary to personally track these ideas. During a short break, Olivia walked over. "Looks like you're taking this seriously," she teased, nodding toward the notes he'd scribbled. He glanced at the page, feeling the corners of his mouth turn upward slightly. "I'm not sure how these smaller-scale investments will mesh with the broader goals of my corporation, but I see value here, something that transcends raw numbers." She sipped her tea thoughtfully. "Art can reach places in people that spreadsheets can't. That alone can change communities." Before they could continue, Alice called everyone's attention back to the table. They spent another hour refining plans, dates for a potential pilot event, discussion of which neighborhoods might benefit most, talk of inviting local media for coverage. By the time the group began dispersing, they had formed the skeleton of a meaningful partnership. As the cafe's lights dimmed to signal closing time, Alexander helped gather the leftover notes. People trickled out the door, exchanging thanks and promises to stay in touch. Eventually, only he and Olivia remained at the table, along with a few staff members cleaning up. "It feels good to build something from the ground up," she said softly, watching as the last of the group departed, "not just for personal gain, but for a collective sense of purpose." He tucked his notes into his planner. "I've built plenty in my life, but this, it's different. I can't deny there's a certain fulfillment in it." She offered a gentle smile. "I'm glad you're here, Alexander." They moved to the door, stepping out onto the quiet sidewalk. The evening air was cool, streetlights casting geometric shadows on the pavement. For a moment, they stood in silence, each processing the day's discussions and the unexpected synergy of their worlds. Finally, he spoke. I'll have my legal team draw up a preliminary proposal. Maybe you and Alice can review it before we finalize anything. She nodded, yawning lightly from the long day. I'd like that, and afterward, maybe we can talk about your involvement in other upcoming art events. I have a feeling you might be more invested now than you realize. A ghost of a grin crossed his features. He recalled how once he would have scoffed at the notion of caring about local art fairs, but here he was, feeling oddly content. "We'll see," he said, a hint of warmth in his tone. They shared a quick goodnight, heading their separate ways along the dimly lit street. Though he returned to his chauffeured car, and she to her modest apartment nearby, a bond had formed, a sense of alliance, fueled by mutual respect and curiosity about each other's worlds. It was an alliance neither of them had anticipated, yet it carried the promise of new horizons for both. Late that week, Alexander stepped into a sleek conference room at Blackwood Industries. The walls were lined with modern abstract paintings, purchased from established artists, each carefully chosen for its prestige. As he lowered himself into a leather chair, he noticed a shift in the atmosphere. Several board members, including the formidable Janet Caldwell, wore guarded expressions. He had called this meeting to propose the new arts fund he'd been drafting with input from Olivia, Alice, and the group in Brooklyn. On paper, the amount was modest for a corporation of Blackwood Industries' size. Still, it was a departure from their usual investments, and that alone was enough to raise eyebrows among the board. Janet tapped her manicured nails on the polished table. "Alexander, we have concerns. The company has always supported large-scale philanthropic projects with clear returns, like educational programs in technology or expansions in major museums that garner substantial media coverage. But this new proposal, it's low visibility, even if it's well-intentioned." He maintained a calm demeanor. "This is about fostering real impact in local communities. The media coverage might not be as grand at first, but the goal is sustainable support, not quick headlines." Another board member, a man in his 50s named Gregory, frowned. "Our resources are better utilized in ventures that align with our corporate branding strategies. These small arts initiatives don't necessarily propel our public image in the big picture." Alexander clenched his jaw, reminding himself to keep his composure. "It's a fraction of our annual philanthropic budget, a pilot program. If it proves successful, we can consider expanding. If not, we reassess. The risk is minimal, but the potential goodwill is significant." A tense silence followed. Janet glanced around, gauging the other directors' reactions. "Some of us are wondering if personal factors are influencing your decision," she said carefully. "We heard about your recent activities in Brooklyn. Are you certain you're not being swayed by attachments?" For a moment, Alexander felt a flush of anger. He thought of Olivia, the artists, the people who genuinely needed the support. Yet he also understood the board's skepticism. He'd never before championed a cause so far removed from conventional philanthropy. "As CEO, I must consider numerous factors," he said, keeping his voice measured. "Personal attachments, or lack thereof, have no bearing on my commitment to beneficial community relations." Janet studied him, her expression unreadable. Finally, she inclined her head. "All right, Alexander. Let's say we tentatively approve your pilot program. We'll expect clear metrics, public engagement, community feedback, that sort of thing. If it doesn't meet expectations, we'll revisit the allocation of funds." He acknowledged her words with a nod. "That's fair." He noticed the relief, or perhaps resignation, on the faces of some board members. The meeting concluded soon after, with everyone filing out. Janet lingered behind, giving him a pointed look. "You're stepping into new territory. Not everyone here is comfortable with that," she said quietly, gathering her papers. "Make sure you know what you're doing." He met her gaze. "I will." Once alone, he released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. A surge of frustration coursed through him, mixed with determination. He was used to fights on corporate fronts, but this felt different, more personal. The board's insinuation that he was being swayed by attachments struck deeper than he cared to admit. Yet in truth, he was changing, and that shift was rooted in something more than mere corporate strategy. Later that day, he went to a trendy bistro in Manhattan for a scheduled lunch with Olivia and Alice, where they planned to finalize details for the pilot fund. The moment he walked in, he sensed a more upbeat environment. People chatted over fresh salads and artisan coffees. The windows let in natural light, a welcome change from the imposing walls of his office. Olivia waved him over to a small table by the window. She wore a casual blazer over a soft grey shirt, her red hair pulled back in a low ponytail. Alice stood to greet him, quickly launching into talk of the paperwork. "I brought the preliminary contract," she said, placing a folder on the table. "It outlines how the fund will be managed and the reporting we'll do for your corporation." He glanced at the folder, nodding. "Looks thorough. My board wants clear metrics, so we'll need monthly updates on progress, attendance at workshops, new artists recruited, community impact surveys." Alice smiled, scribbling notes. "We can handle that. The main gallery in Brooklyn will be our first test site." Olivia caught his eye as Alice explained the finer details. He picked up on her wordless question. "Was everything all right?" He gave a brief nod. She reached across the table and gently squeezed his hand. The small gesture felt more comforting than he expected. Once Alice stepped away to answer a call, Olivia leaned in. "You seem tense. Was the board meeting difficult?" He grimaced slightly. "They're skeptical, worried I'm mixing business with personal motivation." She searched his face. "Are you worried they might be right?" Alexander looked down at the folder, recalling the passion he'd seen in the Brooklyn art community. "Not exactly. For the first time, I'm pushing for something because I believe it truly matters, not just for the company's bottom line." She gave him a soft smile. "And that's worth a fight, isn't it?" He allowed himself a faint chuckle, though the tension in his chest hadn't fully abated. "It is. I'm not backing down. Still, confronting the board makes me realize how alone I've been in my approach to life. Maybe I need to trust others a bit more." She nodded, her gaze warm. "You're not alone, Alexander." He let her words settle, appreciating the reassurance. Moments later, Alice returned, and they resumed their planning. Business talk blended with personal as they mapped out timelines and discussed upcoming gallery events. Despite the conflict he'd faced earlier, he couldn't deny the sense of purpose humming beneath each bullet point on the agenda. By the time lunch ended, he felt a cautious optimism. The first real confrontation with the board had been tense, but he had held his ground. Stepping onto the sidewalk outside the bistro, he glanced at the bustling city streets and realized he'd never been so invested in something beyond pure commerce. This fight felt personal, perhaps because, for the first time, he allowed his heart to guide at least part of the way. Alexander found himself back in Brooklyn, this time outside a once-abandoned building near the waterfront. The city's grey skies offered a faint drizzle, and the cold wind carried hints of the East River. Despite the gloomy weather, a small crowd had assembled to see the pilot program in action. The structure was slated to become a temporary studio for local artists, funded by Blackwood Industries' New Arts Initiative. A local news crew hovered around, capturing sound bites for the evening broadcast. Stepping inside, Alexander surveyed the renovated interiors. It still smelled of fresh paint, and industrial lamps hung from the high ceiling. He noticed buckets of art supplies, second-hand easels, and mismatched furniture arranged in a makeshift lounge. Several artists, including Olivia, greeted him with warm smiles. It felt good to see the fruits of their effort materialize, even if it was only the beginning. Alice Morgan approached, carrying a clipboard that looked far too heavy for her slight frame. "We had more volunteers than expected," she told him, "and a few local businesses chipped in with donations, chairs, tables, that sort of thing." He nodded appreciatively, eyes scanning the details. "It's coming together. The board wants monthly reports, but I think these visuals will be stronger than any data I can present." Just then, a local reporter in a bright red coat stepped forward, cameraman in tow. "Mr. Blackwood, could we get a quick statement?" Alexander resisted the reflexive urge to brush her off. Instead, he offered a polite smile. "We're happy to support emerging artists," he said, choosing his words carefully. "Programs like this transform empty buildings into hubs of creativity, fostering community engagement. It's a small step, but a meaningful one." Satisfied, the reporter moved on to talk to some of the artists. Alexander felt a tap on his shoulder. "Olivia." She beckoned him closer to a section of the space where a group of younger artists were unpacking supplies. "They're from a community center across town," she explained. "They want to do a mural project highlighting local stories." He walked over and exchanged introductions. One young painter and Melody seemed especially excited. "I've never had a studio space before," she said, eyes shining with possibility. "At home, I paint in my bedroom, which is tiny." "This is incredible." Alexander nodded, recalling how different his life was at that age. He had been consumed by ambition, driven by paternal expectations. "I'm looking forward to seeing what you create here," he replied, surprising himself with the warmth in his voice. As the day wore on, he assisted with small tasks, moving boxes, setting up makeshift dividers, discussing potential events to showcase the artist's work. He rarely handled such hands-on duties, but the physical activity felt oddly satisfying. Each gesture reminded him that success wasn't measured solely by corporate expansions or shareholder returns. Olivia caught up with him near a broken window that volunteers were preparing to replace. She offered him a bottle of water and a grateful smile. "You look more at ease than I've ever seen you," she observed. He took a sip, gazing around. "It's strange, but I am..." "There's a sense of immediate impact here. No waiting for quarterly reports or analyzing market shares. You can see the benefit in real time." She nodded. "That's why the arts matter so much to communities. They allow people to express and share parts of themselves they might otherwise hide. You're giving them that chance." Their conversation was cut short when a burst of excited voices echoed across the room. A group was cheering because they had successfully hung a large canvas on a newly installed partition. The enthusiasm was infectious. Even Alexander found himself smiling at the scene. A few minutes later, he stepped outside for air. The drizzle had let up, leaving the ground slick and reflective. Across the street, a van bearing the Blackwood Industries logo idled, ready to drive him back to Manhattan. Usually, he left quickly once his public obligations ended. But today, he lingered. He glanced at his watch. There were meetings waiting, emails to answer, but for once, the thought of rushing back felt unappealing. He felt a shadow fall across him and turned to see Olivia, hands stuffed in the pockets of her coat. "Heading out?" she asked. He considered the question. In a moment, still letting everything sink in. She joined him, leaning against the brick wall. Her eyes reflected the same sense of pride he felt. "The energy in there is a reflection of you, too. You took a risk. It might be a small test compared to the magnitude of your company's ventures, but it's a start." He mulled that over. "Maybe a series of small tests is exactly what I need to keep going." They stood in comfortable silence, sharing a rare moment of contentment. Even though bigger challenges loomed, convincing the board, Managing public perception, balancing multiple ambitions, today felt like a genuine, albeit modest, win. Alexander decided he could carry that feeling with him as he braced for whatever came next. The next few weeks brought the usual torrent of corporate demands, high-stakes negotiations, investor dinners, and strategic planning sessions. Between these obligations, Alexander managed sporadic visits to the Brooklyn art space. Each visit reminded him why he'd championed the project in the first place. Yet, a subtle tension brewed in his mind. He felt torn between preserving Blackwood Industries' corporate interests and nurturing a cause that mattered to him on a personal level. Late one evening, he sat in his office reviewing a recent financial report. The city's lights sparkled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the hum of distant traffic filled the silence. He paused when he came across a memo about the Arts Fund. A note in the margins indicated a concern from the finance department. The program wasn't showing immediate returns. He clenched his jaw. Of course, it wasn't. The entire point was to invest in community and culture, not direct profit. Still, the mention prickled at him, stirring up old voices, echoes of his father's lectures about never letting emotion cloud judgment, about how philanthropic endeavors should always yield tangible benefits. He pushed the memo aside, leaning back in his chair. A flash of memory came. The day he first saw Olivia in the rain, how she'd been so protective of her canvases. That unwavering devotion to her art had compelled him to act without thinking about cost or gain. He wondered if he would have done the same if he'd been taught more compassion in his youth. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. Leonard Hughes entered, carrying a file. "Sorry to disturb you this late, but I figured you'd still be here." He placed the folder on the desk. "The new partnership proposal. You mentioned wanting to see it before morning." Alexander glanced at the clock, noting it was well past normal business hours. "Thanks. You can leave it." "I'll review it tonight." Leonard hesitated. "Something on your mind? You've seemed conflicted lately." Alexander offered a tight smile. "Balancing the philanthropic project with the demands of the board, that's all." Leonard cleared his throat, taking a seat. "If you ask me, it's not just about the board, is it? Ever since you met Olivia and started this arts initiative, you've changed." He kept his voice neutral, but his eyes reflected genuine concern. "I'm not saying it's bad, just different." Alexander laced his fingers together, acknowledging Leonard's observation. "I know. But I'm finding it harder than I expected to reconcile these two sides of my life. The board sees any departure from profit-driven goals as a potential risk. Meanwhile, I've begun to care about something beyond the bottom line." Leonard nodded. "For what it's worth, I think it's a good development. But you should be prepared. The board might challenge this direction more aggressively if the numbers don't measure up soon." With that unsettling thought, Leonard left. Alexander stared at the folder, but his focus had shifted. He grabbed his phone and texted Olivia, asking if she was still at the studio. She replied that she'd just locked up and was heading to her apartment, but she'd be happy to meet another time. He felt a strange pang of disappointment, longing for a conversation with someone outside corporate politics. Instead, he resolved to visit her at the gallery the next evening. When he arrived, he found Olivia alone, painting a large cityscape on a canvas that spanned almost an entire wall. The lights were dim, except for a few spotlights angled toward her work. Music played softly from a portable speaker. She glanced over her shoulder and smiled. "Didn't think you'd be here this late. Everything okay?" He stepped closer, noticing the fine details, each brushstroke capturing the interplay of light and shadow on urban rooftops. "I'm fine," he lied, his voice betraying a hint of fatigue. "I just needed a break from numbers and spreadsheets." She set her brush aside. Board trouble, he nodded. They keep pressuring me to show a return on the arts fund. Some are convinced I'm throwing money away on a cause that doesn't align with our core business. Olivia's expression turned pensive. That's part of why it's so hard for independent artists. Funding always hinges on some tangible outcome. But art doesn't always fit neatly into a graph. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. It doesn't. Yet I can't deny that same intangible quality is what's drawing me in. She studied him carefully. So where does that leave you? He paused, crossing the spacious room to get a better look at her painting. I'm not sure. I have responsibilities as CEO. That can't change. But I'm beginning to realize I can't keep ignoring my own instincts. Maybe it's possible to do both, drive the corporation forward and support the community. But the board... She came to stand beside him. You can't let them bully you into going against what you believe is right. Her words resonated, reawakening his resolve. I won't, he said quietly, though the weight of old doubts remained. He watched as she swirled a paintbrush in water to cleanse it, her every movement tinged with unwavering dedication. In that instant, he understood that his internal conflict was, in many ways, a reflection of her fearless commitment to art. They stood in companionable silence for a while, listening to the gentle background music. Alexander felt a tangle of anxieties simmering in his chest. Yet being here, observing her creative process, offered him a sense of calm. Even if the road ahead was fraught with tension and potential failure, he knew he wouldn't retreat to his old ways without a fight. Just when Alexander thought he could navigate the board's skepticism, a new challenge arose with devastating speed. Early one morning, Leonard burst into his office, looking more alarmed than Alexander had ever seen. He clutched a tablet showing a series of urgent headlines. Blackwood Industries' main competitor, Everline Corp., is making aggressive moves, Leonard said, voice taut. They've acquired a significant stake in several properties around the Brooklyn Arts District. Rumor has it they're planning to drive up rents and push out independent artists to develop high-end complexes. Alexander grabbed the tablet, scanning the headlines. Everline's CEO, Sebastian Wright, was known for his ruthless tactics. If he succeeded in transforming the area into a playground for luxury condos and upscale businesses, the very culture Alex had begun to nurture could vanish. The pilot program's progress would be crushed under gentrification and skyrocketing lease prices. He rose from his chair, a surge of anger fueling him. They must have caught wind that we were supporting the local scene. Now they want to profit off the same neighborhoods we're trying to help. Leonard nodded. We can't compete for every piece of real estate, not without risking hundreds of millions. Are you willing to escalate a bidding war? Alexander's jaw clenched. For a moment, he was pulled back into his old mindset, business at all costs. But now, the stakes felt personal. If Everline took control of the Brooklyn district, artists like Olivia and countless others would be priced out, effectively ending the pilot project. We need a strategy, he said, forcing himself to remain calm. I'm not letting them bulldoze everything. Later that afternoon, he arranged a meeting with key advisors, including a real estate analyst and a PR consultant. Around a gleaming conference table, they hashed out tactics, raising Blackwood's own property purchases in the area, lobbying city officials, even considering an injunction based on community preservation laws. The more they brainstormed, the more complicated it became. Everline was a giant competitor with deep pockets and no qualms about public image when chasing profit. When the meeting ended, Alexander found he could hardly breathe. The corporate siege he was used to was nothing compared to the personal blow of seeing an entire community threatened. In a rare decision, he cancelled his remaining appointments to drive to the art studio in Brooklyn, needing to share the news with Olivia and the others. As his car navigated the congested streets, he felt a growing sense of dread. He arrived to find Olivia and Alice discussing an upcoming gallery showcase. Before they could greet him, he launched into an explanation, his voice clipped with urgency. Everline Corp is moving in on the neighborhood. They're buying properties left and right. Your new studios could be at risk if they decide to jack up rents or refuse to renew leases. Alice paled. That can't be good. They're known for redeveloping areas into high-priced real estate. Local artists can't afford those costs. Olivia stared at Alexander, eyes wide with concern. Is there any way to stop them? Alexander sighed. We can try legal routes or city council pressure, but Everline has resources and influence on their side. We're up against the clock. Tension filled the air. A few of the artists overheard and approached, their faces etched with worry. Melody, the young painter, clutched a folder of her sketches. If they push us out, I'll have nowhere to go, she said, voice trembling. Frustration tightened Alexander's chest. He had meant to protect these people, but the scale of Everline's operation posed a formidable barrier. Unbidden, doubts surfaced. Had he been naive to think he could nurture such a project within a cutthroat market? Olivia placed a steadying hand on his arm. We'll figure something out, she insisted. We have to at least fight back. He looked at her, noting the determination in her gaze. She reminded him that retreat wasn't an option. We will, he said firmly, though he felt cornered. But it's going to be a battle. That night, back at his penthouse, he paced by the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city lights twinkled below, oblivious to the turmoil roiling inside him. He already knew the board would be hesitant to fund a full-scale confrontation with Everline. Most executives would rather let the arts program collapse than engage in a potentially unprofitable turf war. His phone buzzed with a message from Helena, who had heard rumblings about Everline's move. She urged him to remain steadfast, reminding him that true leadership meant standing by one's principles, even under pressure. But as he pored over real estate maps and legal briefs, he wondered if his newly awakened conscience could withstand the harsh realities of corporate greed. A part of him was tempted to cut his losses, focus on Blackwood Industries' core ventures, and salvage his standing with the board. Yet each time he entertained that notion, he pictured Olivia and the artists forced from their haven. He couldn't bear being complicit in such an outcome. Hours later, he finally sank into bed, eyes aching, thoughts relentless. He had reached a breaking point, one that would force him to choose between old loyalties to the bottom line and a new moral compass he was only just beginning to trust. 2 days of frantic maneuvering followed. Alexander summoned real estate lawyers, public relations experts, and city liaisons. Together, they crafted a temporary solution, a community trust that would acquire select properties to keep the rent stable. It was a complex arrangement requiring swift legal work and carefully timed announcements. The risk was high. If the trust failed to secure enough support, Everline would seize complete control of the neighborhood. He launched a relentless media campaign, highlighting how Everline's move threatened local culture. Reporters swarmed the Brooklyn studios, interviewing artists who spoke passionately about preserving their creative space. Public sentiment leaned in their favor, at least for the moment. Olivia, Alice, and even Helena joined the effort, sharing personal stories of how art had shaped their lives. Though he wasn't typically one for public persuasion, Alexander found himself leading a cause that, just weeks ago, he never could have imagined championing. One afternoon, he paced anxiously in the conference room with his legal team while phone lines buzzed. Each call brought a new twist. Some landowners were open to selling to the trust. Others waited to see if Everline would offer more money. Alexander wrestled with the knowledge that the trust's funds were finite and Blackwood Industries could only afford so much before jeopardizing other critical ventures. Finally, the lead attorney hung up from an important negotiation and turned to Alexander. "We got it," she said. a triumphant edge in her voice. The 3 key properties we needed to anchor the trust just agreed to sell to us. That means the artist studios should be safe from a rent spike, at least for a couple of years. Alexander exhaled, relief flooding him. That's something, he said, voice shaky with pent-up tension. We'll need to keep working to protect the rest, but this buys us time. Within an hour, word spread. Local news outlets picked up the story, praising the sudden collaboration between the New Arts Fund, private donors, and the community trust. The message was clear. They were standing their ground against Eveline. At the Brooklyn studio, artists cheered. Alexander received messages of gratitude from people he'd never even met, an elderly sculptor from the next borough, a group of high school art students. That evening, he drove to the renovated space where a casual celebration was underway. Music echoed across the wide halls, and laughter reverberated off the old brick walls. He saw Olivia seated on a paint-splattered stool, chatting with a small circle of friends. Upon noticing him, she excused herself and walked over. "You did it," she said, her smile as luminous as the string lights overhead. "We're still here, still creating." He attempted a modest shrug. "For now, yes. We've secured the most crucial properties, but it's only a short-term victory. Eveline won't back off easily." She pressed a gentle hand to his shoulder. "Short-term or not, it matters." A cluster of younger artists came by to thank him, each brimming with excitement about the trust's success. He shook their hands or exchanged a few words, though he downplayed his involvement. It felt strange to receive gratitude for an endeavor that, in the past, he might have dismissed. When the group moved on, he and Olivia found a quieter corner. She picked up 2 cans of soda from a nearby table, offering him one. "No champagne," he teased. She laughed. "We're on a budget, remember? Plus, I have to paint later." "I don't want a fuzzy head." They tapped their cans together in a light-hearted salute. For a moment, they simply enjoyed each other's presence. Alexander's mind drifted to the board's inevitable reaction. He had diverted company resources into what they considered a non-essential cause. No doubt there would be backlash. Reading the concern in his eyes, Olivia's smile wavered. "You've risked a lot to protect this place. Are you worried about what happens next?" He set down his soda, a resigned sigh escaping him. "I'm prepared to defend my decisions, but the board will demand results. They'll want to see measurable community benefit, a positive impact on our public image, something to justify the expense." She bit her lip. "That sounds like a lot of pressure. I wish I could help more." Alexander studied her face, touched by her willingness to stand by him. "You're already helping. None of this would have made sense if I didn't believe in what you and the others do. Even a partial victory tonight reminds me this fight is worthwhile." They lingered in that moment, the soft hum of conversation around them a testament to the fragile triumph they had achieved. It was a brief respite, a reminder that resilience could conquer obstacles, at least for a while. Despite the persistent uncertainty, Alexander felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps sustaining this delicate balance between corporate duty and personal conviction was possible, if he continued to embrace the empathy he had so long denied. A week after the community trust deal, tensions simmered rather than dissipated. Eveline Corp publicly condemned the hostile acquisition of key neighborhood properties by Blackwood's allied trust. This sparked debate in the media over who was truly in the right. Some business commentators argued that Blackwood Industries was meddling beyond its scope, while others praised the company for upholding community values. Alexander found himself in a swirl of contrasting opinions and personal misgivings. The partial victory felt overshadowed by an impending sense that Eveline's retaliation would be swift and fierce. The board's more conservative members also expressed disdain for his risk-taking, warning that philanthropic endeavors shouldn't morph into a turf war. During a conference call with Helena, he unburdened himself, pacing the length of his penthouse living room. "I put the company in a difficult spot," he admitted, pressing the phone to his ear. "The board sees the arts initiative as a vanity project that's spinning out of control. Everline sees us as a direct threat. Meanwhile, the artists are counting on me to protect them." On the other end, Helena's voice was laced with understanding. "Leadership often means making choices that won't please everyone. You knew that going in, but I sense you're more conflicted now because your heart is in it. That's new ground for you, Alex." He sank into an armchair, gazing out at the distant skyline. "It is. I can't remember the last time I felt so personally responsible for something beyond just profits. It's unsettling." She let out a soft chuckle. Unsettling isn't always bad. Sometimes it's a sign you're on the brink of genuine change. Don't ignore that feeling. Use it to guide your decisions. They ended the call on a note of cautious optimism. Alexander set his phone aside, fully aware that the brink of change felt more like standing on a precipice. The next day, he convened a select group within Blackwood Industries, people who weren't strictly beholden to the board's rigid mindset. This team included Leonard, a couple of progressive-minded directors, and a social impact advisor from their legal department. Together, they mapped out potential strategies to ensure the Arts Fund would keep growing despite the pressure from Everline and the board. In a small, glass-walled meeting room, charts and documents covered a circular table. They discussed forging alliances with other corporate donors, applying for city grants, and leveraging the positive media attention they still had. While the conversation carried a layer of tension, it also exuded a sense of purpose. Each person there believed in what the Arts Initiative stood for. Leonard tapped a pen against the table. "We could partner with philanthropic organizations that already have a track record in preserving cultural districts," he suggested. "If we show the board we're not alone in this, they might see it as less of a personal crusade." Alexander nodded. "Good idea. Let's also see if we can incorporate an internship or mentorship component that might attract more public support. People respect educational opportunities." The social impact advisor chimed in. "We'll have to handle it carefully, ensuring we don't make promises we can't keep. But yes, synergy with education could broaden our appeal." After hours of debate, they emerged with a framework that promised resilience. Alexander felt a surge of cautious relief. However, he knew none of it would matter if Everline undercut them by buying up more land or convincing the city council to rezone the district in their favor. That evening, he met Olivia at a low-key cafe. She had spent the day brainstorming new art classes for teens in the community. They found a small corner table, the scent of fresh bread and roasted coffee enveloping them. In the soft lamplight, her features seemed particularly resolute. "How did the meeting go?" she asked, sipping a cappuccino. "Better than I expected," he replied. "We have a plan, albeit fragile. The real test is whether we can execute it before Everline escalates." She nodded, tucking a strand of red hair behind her ear. "I've been thinking, maybe there's a way we can rally the local residents, not just the art community. Many of them would hate to see their neighborhood turn into cookie-cutter luxury developments. If we get enough voices calling for preservation, it might push officials to side with us." He leaned back, considering her suggestion. "Grassroots support could be powerful. It's definitely worth exploring." She placed a hand on his arm, her touch light but reassuring. "We'll do it together. You're not carrying this alone." Alexander felt a warmth spread in his chest, a sense of genuine partnership that he'd rarely experienced in personal or professional spheres. The notion of together held more meaning than he initially realized. They discussed potential tactics, local petitions, neighborhood meetings, even an outdoor art festival to showcase the cultural significance of the area. The conversation eventually drifted into more personal matters. She shared stories of her childhood, moving from city to city, finding solace in painting. He opened up about his father's relentless focus on wealth, how it shaped him into a fortress of ambition. By the time they parted ways, the path ahead still looked fraught with obstacles, but a sense of unity buoyed them. Alexander recognized that the next major confrontation would be more challenging than anything he'd faced so far. Yet he felt the stirrings of a deeper resolve, prepared to merge heart and mind in a struggle that transcended mere business. As he walked into the cool night air, he realized that the greatest barrier was not external, rather, it lay in trusting himself to hold fast to these newfound convictions. A steely November wind rattled the tall windows of Blackwood Industries' top-floor boardroom as Alexander prepared for the most critical meeting since he'd assumed the role of CEO. Through the panoramic view, Manhattan stretched beneath a metallic sky, reflecting his own sense of foreboding. The board members filtered in, their faces tense, each armed with meticulously prepared notes and figures. Once everyone was seated around the long, polished table, Alexander rose. A hush fell over the room, the subdued lighting picking out each line of worry on the directors' faces. Janet Caldwell sat near the center, her gaze unwavering. Gregory, the finance hawk, wore an expression that mixed skepticism and impatience. Leonard quietly took his usual spot behind Alexander, ready to offer support in whatever way he could. Alexander clicked a remote. A projection screen displayed bar graphs and bullet points, the Arts Fund's accomplishments, the formation of the Community Trust, and the ongoing standoff with Everline Corp. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice controlled but resonating with an undercurrent of determination, "I've called this special session to address the ramifications of our philanthropic strategy in Brooklyn. We've secured key properties to prevent Everline's hostile takeover. However, the fight is far from over." He outlined the escalating tactics Everline was employing, lobbying city officials, pressuring local landlords, and running a negative PR campaign that painted Blackwood Industries as meddling do-gooders lacking solid business sense. At each point, he explained how the arts initiative's real impact was measured by community stabilization rather than immediate profit. The tension in the room thickened with every word. When he finished, Janet placed her reading glasses on the table with a light click. "Alexander," she said, tone neutral, "we recognize the Community Trust has generated positive publicity, but at what cost? Everline is poised to retaliate in ways that could undermine Blackwood Industries' core operations. Not to mention, some of our own investors are growing wary." Gregory nodded, scanning a spreadsheet. "I respect your intentions, but this is crossing into a drawn-out battle. We're not a charity organization. Our shareholders expect returns." Alexander steadied himself, careful to keep the frustration from his voice. "Our brand strength and corporate legacy stand to gain if we show genuine commitment to social responsibility. We've already seen improvements in public sentiment." A quiet scoff came from the far end of the table. A younger board member, Robert Finch, who rarely spoke, shifted in his seat. "Commitment is one thing. Open conflict with Everline is another. They're threatening legal action and undercutting our deals in other markets. This philanthropic focus could jeopardize our expansions in Europe and Asia." An undercurrent of restlessness gripped the room. Leonard cleared his throat softly, stepping forward. "With all due respect, our numbers show that while we've devoted more resources to the Arts Fund than initially planned, it's still a fraction of our overall budget. The negative press from Everline is concerning, but the public sees us as defenders of a cultural district rather than heartless conglomerates. That goodwill has value." Janet fixed her attention back on Alexander. Is there a plan to contain the fallout if Eveline escalates further? Alexander nodded, pressing a button on the remote. Another slide appeared, detailing potential alliances with charitable foundations, local advocacy groups, and city government officials. I've already begun talks with organizations that champion affordable housing and cultural preservation. The idea is to build a coalition strong enough that Eveline can't simply buy its way to dominance. Murmurs rippled across the table. The board members traded glances, calculating how best to proceed. Eventually, Janet raised her hand for silence. Let's be blunt. We need a definitive timeline for when this investment either stabilizes or we cut our losses. This can't be an indefinite crusade. Alexander's gaze flickered across the room. He despised the thought of an arbitrary deadline, but he recognized the board's stance. Give me 4 months, he said evenly. In that time, I'll finalize alliances and secure enough local and political support to ensure the district's sustainability. If progress is insufficient, we'll reevaluate our involvement. A stretch of charged quiet followed, each director gauging the stakes. Finally, Janet nodded. 4 months, Gregory muttered grudging agreement. Robert Finch pursed his lips, but said nothing. Leonard exhaled, relief evident in the subtle slump of his shoulders. Alexander closed the presentation and resumed his seat, feeling the weight of new pressure bearing down on him. He had staked not only his professional credibility, but also his personal convictions on this crusade. As the board members gathered their papers and prepared to leave, Janet lingered. Her expression wavered between concern and caution. I know you believe in this, Alexander, she said quietly, but don't underestimate Eveline's resolve. He nodded, saying nothing. Once the room emptied, he slumped in his chair, staring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He had 4 months to prove that compassion and commerce could coexist without crippling the company. Whether that was enough time, or whether Eveline would force a confrontation before then, lingered as a pressing uncertainty. He ran a hand through his hair, determined to stand by his pledge, no matter how formidable the challenge might become. The next few days ushered in a brief lull, as though the city itself paused to catch its breath. Eveline Corp seemed momentarily subdued, perhaps strategizing out of the public eye. Blackwood Industries continued its daily operations, but Alexander felt the electric undercurrent of tension pulsing beneath every meeting and memo. Everyone knew the stakes had risen. One cold evening, he found himself driving alone to Connecticut. Helena had invited him for a simple dinner, something warm and personal away from Manhattan's pressures. As he navigated the winding roads leading to her estate, he noticed the way the bare trees arched overhead, creating a canopy of intertwining branches against the dim twilight. The serenity of the landscape offered a stark contrast to the turmoil in his life. Helena greeted him at the door with a gentle smile. She wore a soft sweater and slippers, looking every bit the nurturing figure that had once tried to guide a grief-stricken boy. The house smelled of roasting vegetables and homemade bread. Alexander shrugged off his coat, absorbing the sudden quiet. "I made your favorite," Helena said as she guided him to the dining room. The table was set for 2, candles flickering softly. "Roast chicken with thyme. I recall you used to like it when you were younger, though you never wanted to admit it." He managed a faint smile. "I still do. Thank you." They ate at a leisurely pace, discussing little moments of daily life rather than business crises. Helena told him about her garden, dormant now in the winter months, and about a neighbor's granddaughter who had shown a talent for painting. Alexander listened, the tension in his shoulders gradually easing. Eventually, Helena poured them each a cup of chamomile tea. She studied him from across the small dining table, her eyes kind but penetrating. "How are you holding up, really?" He set his teacup down, inhaling the herbal aroma. It's overwhelming. The board gave me 4 months to show tangible results or reconsider the entire arts project. Meanwhile, Eveline is biding its time for another strike. I can't shake the feeling that I'm juggling too many priorities. Helena nodded. You've chosen a path that requires not only your business acumen, but also your heart. That's never easy. He gazed out the window, watching branches sway gently in the moonlight. I'm questioning everything I've been taught. My father always insisted love or compassion were vulnerabilities, distractions from the real goal, success. But the more I push forward, the more I realize how hollow success can be if I ignore my conscience. She reached across the table, placing a warm hand over his. You're redefining success on your own terms. That takes courage. And it's normal to doubt yourself along the way. A soft exhale escaped him. I just hope I'm not leading everyone into a losing battle. The artist, the community, Olivia. They're depending on me to stand firm. Helena's expression shifted, a small smile forming. Olivia is special to you, isn't she? His eyes flickered with an unspoken admission. She makes me see the world differently, and I don't want to disappoint her, or the people relying on me. Helena squeezed his hand gently before withdrawing. Disappointment is a risk in anything worth doing. But you have the strength to see this through, as long as you allow yourself to draw on the support of those who care for you. They talked long into the night, sipping tea and recalling pieces of the past. The times Helena had tried to soften Alexander's father's strict approach, the rare moments of warmth in a household dominated by ambition. Those early memories, though painful, now served as a lens through which he could understand his current struggle. When he finally stood to leave, Helena walked him to the door, offering a scarf for the chilly ride home. "Keep going, Alex," she said, using the more affectionate nickname she'd reserved for him in childhood. "Don't let fear keep you from what's right. I believe in you." He nodded, thanking her for the evening. Driving away, he felt a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. The respite offered a momentary calm, but also highlighted the vast responsibility resting on his shoulders. He glanced at the passenger seat where the scarf lay folded, Helena's gentle reminder to guard himself against the cold, both literally and metaphorically. He inhaled deeply, setting his course back to Manhattan, aware that the stillness of the night would soon give way to the storm he knew was brewing. In the days following his visit to Helena's estate, Alexander found a renewed sense of resolve propelling him forward. He doubled down on the community outreach efforts, personally visiting local businesses to encourage them to join the coalition against Eveline's takeover. At first, some shop owners looked at him with wary disbelief, unused to a corporate titan showing up in their cramped back rooms to talk about preserving neighborhood character. But Alexander insisted, conversing with them as equals. Bit by bit, they responded to his sincerity. One afternoon, he joined Olivia for a small neighborhood meeting in a modest library hall. The group consisted of teachers, cafe owners, a local pastor, and a smattering of residents concerned about rising rents. Paper cups of coffee were scattered on folding tables. Children played quietly in a corner. This was a world far removed from the polished corridors of high finance. Yet Alexander found himself feeling more at home here than he ever had in a boardroom. He introduced himself plainly. "I'm Alexander Blackwood. Yes, that Blackwood," he said, drawing a few raised eyebrows. "I understand your worries about Eveline's expansion. My company is working with a community trust to keep property costs reasonable." The pastor, an older gentleman with kind eyes, leaned forward. "We've heard talk of your initiative. It sounds hopeful, but we've also seen big corporations come and go, making promises they don't keep. Why should we trust that your plan is different?" Alexander hesitated a fraction of a second, feeling Olivia's reassuring presence beside him. "Because this time, it's personal. We aren't just funneling money from a distance. We're here on the ground, connecting with residents and artists. I've seen the value this neighborhood brings to the city, and I'm committed to safeguarding it." A soft murmur spread through the hall. Several attendees nodded, though a few remained guarded. Olivia stepped in, her voice steady. "The arts program has already helped local talent find a place to thrive. If we lose these spaces to luxury condos, we lose a piece of the community's soul. Mr. Blackwood and I believe that's worth protecting." The gathering continued with questions, some pointed, others curious. Alexander fielded them honestly, admitting that the future held no guarantees. All he could promise was his dedication and the resources he'd muster. By the end, a sense of cautious optimism seemed to take hold. Later that evening, he accompanied Olivia back to her studio. The streets were quiet under a tapestry of stars, and a gentle breeze rustled stray papers along the sidewalk. As they reached the door, she pulled out her keys, pausing to look at him. "You spoke from the heart tonight," she said softly. "I can tell that's not easy for you." He gave a small smile. "I'm learning. For so long, I believed emotions had no place in business, that it was all about efficiency and control, but that viewpoint seems incomplete now." She unlocked the door and flipped on the studio lights, revealing canvases of half-finished scenes. Colorful paint tubes lay scattered on a table, brushes in various stages of drying. He recognized one painting from the early days of her exhibit, an urban scene set in the rain, reminiscent of how they first met. "You've changed, Alexander," she said, setting her bag aside. "I see a man who's stepping beyond the shell he built to protect himself." He exhaled, wandering past a row of canvases. "I often wonder if I've grown softer or weaker, but then times like tonight make me realize it might be strength to care more openly." She approached, her green eyes reflecting warmth. "I believe it is." A moment of intimacy flickered between them, something unspoken passing in the hush of the studio. They had walked a strange path, CEO and artist, united by an unlikely cause. But in that space, it felt like the most natural alignment in the world. Quietly, she placed a hand on his shoulder. He drew her closer, feeling the steady pulse of her breath. The city outside hummed with distant traffic, but within these walls, there was calm. They stood for a few moments, letting the closeness speak more than words could convey. Then, almost shyly, they pulled apart. He cleared his throat. "I should go. I have an early meeting. The fight with Everline continues, and I can't afford to lose ground." She nodded, accompanying him to the door. "Take care, Alexander. Don't let the pressure drown out what you've discovered." He paused before stepping out, turning back to meet her eyes. "I won't. Not this time." The door closed softly behind him. Outside, the crisp night air felt cleansing. He made his way home, thoughts swirling, yet a new sense of determination in his stride. He had begun to realize that letting himself feel, truly feel, had not sabotaged his ambition, but rather tempered it with purpose. It was an unforeseen emergence of empathy in a man who once believed sentiment was a flaw. And though the challenges ahead were immense, each day brought a deeper resolve, forged by the knowledge that he was fighting for something real and meaningful. The 4-month countdown hovered in the back of Alexander's mind like a constant drumbeat. Each passing week chipped away at the time he'd pledged to the board. He began consolidating resources and solidifying alliances faster than he ever had for a traditional business deal. His corporate office often buzzed late into the night with conferences and strategy sessions, while the pilot arts program in Brooklyn continued to thrive under his protective umbrella. One morning, he convened a small war room-style meeting in his office. Leonard was there, along with 2 board members who cautiously supported his efforts, a public relations specialist, and the real estate attorney overseeing the community trust. The mood was determined but tense. Alexander tapped a printout. Our immediate goal is to secure a vote of confidence from the City Council, endorsing our coalition as a force for cultural preservation. If we can get them to name the district an official cultural landmark, Everline will have fewer avenues to force displacement. The attorney nodded, adjusting her glasses. We have a hearing in 3 weeks. We'll need a compelling narrative about the historical significance of the area and its role in supporting local artists. That's where witness testimonies come in. Community members, experts in urban development, possibly well-known cultural figures who can testify on the district's importance. Leonard scribbled notes. Media coverage will be crucial. We'll want positive stories circulating before the hearing. Maybe a feature article in a major paper focusing on personal stories of artists who found success or stability thanks to the initiative. Alexander glanced around the table, reading the room. We can't afford to be passive. This is our best shot at formal protection for the neighborhood. Let's not waste it. After the meeting, his day spun into rapid-fire engagements, calls with philanthropic foundations, discussions with city officials, and quick check-ins with Olivia and Alice about upcoming community events. Each conversation left him more resolved, but also more acutely aware of the ticking clock. He often found his thoughts drifting to the possibility of failure. If they didn't secure the council's support, Everline's push would likely overpower them. The board would withdraw their reluctant backing, and he would stand alone. That evening, a text from Olivia urged him to swing by the studio. She mentioned a surprise waiting for him, something that might lift his spirits. He arrived at dusk, the hallways echoing with the mellow strums of a guitar, one of the artists, apparently, practicing for an upcoming showcase. Olivia guided him to the largest gallery room, which had been cleared to display a new mural. Painted in sweeping strokes, it depicted the Brooklyn skyline entwined with images of community life, families at local diners, children playing hopscotch, street performers dancing. In subtle corners, there were references to recent struggles, protest signs proclaiming "Save Our Homes," paintbrushes raised like torches. Olivia folded her arms, gazing at the mural with a quiet pride. We all worked on it, every artist who uses the space. We wanted a piece that captures both the vibrancy and the resistance here. Alexander studied the layered imagery, feeling a swell of admiration. It's powerful, he said softly. A statement about unity and what's at stake if this place is lost. She nodded. We plan to unveil it at a community event next week, inviting council members and local press. Maybe it'll help show why the area deserves protection. He turned to her, noticing a speck of bright blue paint on her cheek. It will, he affirmed. It's exactly the kind of passion we need to showcase. It speaks louder than 1,000 corporate brochures. They wandered through the gallery, discussing the logistics of the unveiling. Speakers, invitations, possible press coverage. Though the conversation centered on planning, the closeness between them felt undeniable. They paused near a series of smaller canvases, each painted by a different artist in the pilot program. I used to think bigger was always better, Alexander confessed, eyes scanning the paintings. Bigger deals, bigger profits. But sometimes it's the smaller, local expressions that truly resonate. Olivia's smile was tinged with understanding. That's because they're personal. They aren't polished by committees or driven by market analytics. They come straight from the heart. He heard the echo of Helena's words in his mind. That genuine change arises when heart and mind align. He slipped his hands into his pockets, exhaling. The next few weeks will be critical. We need the city council to see that same sincerity. She nodded, resting a hand lightly on his forearm. We'll fight for it, and whatever happens, we'll know we stood for something we believed in. He felt the reassurance in her voice. His shoulders, perpetually tense these days, eased slightly. I appreciate that. They chatted a bit longer before he left for the night, driving back to Manhattan with the image of the mural firmly in his mind. The final push loomed large. Rallies, hearings, and negotiations awaited. He forced himself to remember that transformation rarely came without struggle. This might be the most significant trial of his life, the moment where personal conviction intersected irrevocably with corporate reality. And though the outcome remained uncertain, he believed he was finally ready to face it. A crisp winter morning brought the showdown Alexander both anticipated and dreaded. The city council hearing, held in an imposing municipal building of stone columns and austere marble floors, was set to determine whether the Brooklyn Arts District would receive landmark protections. If granted, these protections would severely limit Eveline's ability to gentrify the area. If not, the months of effort Alexander, Olivia, and countless others had poured in might crumble. The corridor outside the hearing room buzzed with tension. City officials in suits gathered in clusters, local journalists prepped their cameras, and nervous citizens clutched documents that they hoped would sway council members. Helena arrived, greeting Alexander with a warm, steadying smile. Olivia stood a few steps away, deep in conversation with Alice. A small group of artists hovered at the edge of the crowd, each carrying portfolios of sketches, paintings, or photographs to demonstrate the cultural value of their community. Leonard approached Alexander, handing him a neatly typed statement for his testimony. "Thought you might want this as backup," he said, tapping the folder. "But speak from the heart if you can. It served you well before." Alexander offered a faint, grateful nod. The board's ultimatum echoed in his memory. 4 months. He had used nearly every day of that allowance, forging alliances and building a case for preserving the district. Now the moment of truth had arrived. A gavel's sharp crack rang from within the hearing room. People began filing inside. Alexander sat beside Olivia in the audience area, feeling a brush of her coat sleeve against his arm. She leaned close, whispering, "We're ready." A panel of council members presided from a long, elevated bench. Their stern, watchful eyes scanned the gathered crowd. A middle-aged councilwoman in a burgundy blazer cleared her throat, calling the session to order. Representatives of various community groups spoke first, detailing the neighborhood's history and the social impact of the art studio. A local historian described the district's architectural significance, while a teacher emphasized how arts programs had transformed her students' aspirations. Next, Eveline's legal representative took the floor, a poised woman with impeccable posture. She argued that the development Eveline proposed would bring economic growth, jobs, and improved infrastructure. She cast the arts district as underutilized space that could better serve the city through commercial expansion. Her tone was confident, and for a moment, Alexander felt a flash of doubt. Corporate expansion often held significant sway in such hearings. Finally, it was Alexander's turn. He walked to the podium, conscious of every footstep echoing in the cavernous room. As he placed his notes down, he caught Olivia's eye. She offered an encouraging tilt of her head. He began, voice firm. "Members of the council, I'm Alexander Blackwood, CEO of Blackwood Industries. My company has joined forces with local artists, residents, and community leaders to protect this district. We believe economic growth is indeed vital, but not at the expense of displacing an entire culture of creativity and heritage." He paused, scanning the faces of the council members. Some watched impassively, others took notes. "Over the past several months, I've personally witnessed how art transforms lives, fosters resilience, and unites communities. This district isn't simply land to be developed. It's a living tapestry of stories, voices, and hopes." He caught the eye of Eveline's attorney, who regarded him coolly. "While Eveline touts efficiency and modernization," he continued, "we must consider that not all progress is beneficial if it erodes the soul of a neighborhood. Our solution involves a balanced approach, limited development combined with preservation of existing cultural spaces. This way, we can uplift the local economy without erasing its identity." He closed his statement by reminding the council of the intangible benefits that robust artistic communities bring, such as tourism, innovation, and social cohesion. Then he stepped down, returning to his seat beside Olivia. A thin sheen of sweat dampened his collar, but relief coursed through him at having spoken his piece honestly. Several more testimonies followed. Olivia spoke briefly, her words heartfelt, as she described how the art studio had become a refuge for those who found themselves voiceless in mainstream society. The council listened attentively, occasionally interjecting questions. At last, the hearing concluded. The council retired to deliberate. The waiting period felt excruciatingly long. People milled in the corridor, some pacing, others huddling in whispered discussions. Helena offered Alexander a sip from her water bottle, which he declined, too on edge to even consider it. Olivia stood by a window, hands clasped tight. After what seemed like an eternity, the council members re-entered the room. The hush was immediate. The lead councilwoman delivered the verdict, her measured tone revealing little emotion. Having reviewed all testimonies and supporting documents, and in consideration of the neighborhood's established cultural significance, the council finds in favor of designating key sections of the Brooklyn Arts District as a protected cultural site. A wave of stunned relief swept over the room. Applause broke out, despite attempts to maintain decorum. Alexander felt Helena's hand squeeze his shoulder. Olivia's eyes glistened with tears of joy. Leonard let out a quiet whoop, earning him a reproachful glance from the bailiff, but a grin from Alexander. Eveline's representative maintained a dignified silence, snapping shut her portfolio before exiting. The victory was not absolute. Some areas would still be developed, and further negotiations lay ahead, but the crucial heart of the arts community now had legal protection. For Alexander, it felt like a monumental shift. He had steered his corporation into a realm once deemed too sentimental, challenged a powerful adversary, and stood firm for people and ideals he had come to treasure. As the crowd filtered out into the marble hallway, reporters clamored for quotes. Alexander, still absorbing the magnitude of the decision, found himself briefly at a loss for words. He glanced at Olivia, whose face radiated unguarded happiness. In that moment, he recognized that the real triumph wasn't just legal or corporate, it was the vindication of a new path he'd chosen, one where compassion and ambition could coexist, forging a future neither he nor anyone else had fully imagined. In the days following the council's landmark decision, a quiet sense of elation settled over the Brooklyn Arts District. Large swaths of the neighborhood were now protected from hasty redevelopment. The official designation promised stability for local artists and residents, a bulwark against the once looming threat of Eveline Corp. Yet for Alexander, the resolution also signaled a new era for Blackwood Industries, an era in which profitability and social conscience might coexist. He spent a great deal of time at the renovated community studio, often visiting late in the afternoon. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. Olivia, Alice, and the other artists set up new projects, murals, free art classes, and even small performances. There was a sense of optimism, as though the neighborhood had awakened from a long nightmare and found a renewed sense of purpose. On one particular afternoon, Alexander stood by a table strewn with paintbrushes and color-splotched rags, chatting with a group of young artists. Each had a story. Melody, who used to hide her paintings under her bed. Rico, an older man who'd seen the neighborhood change over decades and feared losing his rented space. Ashley, a student who discovered her own talent after stumbling into the gallery one rainy day. They spoke about their future plans, bright with potential. When the conversation ended, he wandered around, letting the hum of creation surround him. It felt calming, even therapeutic, to be in a place where raw imagination shaped reality. Spotting Olivia in a far corner, he made his way over, sidestepping easels. She was deep in concentration, applying careful brushstrokes to a new canvas. Soft orchestral music played from a portable speaker, adding a meditative feel to the space. She acknowledged him with a smile, setting her brush aside. "You look more relaxed than I've ever seen you." He ran a hand through his dark hair, the corners of his mouth lifting. "Funny you should say that. I've been pulled into all sorts of new commitments, speeches, interviews, and a mountain of internal company matters. But I don't know, ever since the council's decision, something's shifted. Maybe I've finally accepted that caring doesn't make me weak." She studied him, her green eyes warm. "I think it's more than acceptance. You've embraced a different part of yourself. That's not easy, especially for someone who's been so guarded." He paused, allowing her words to resonate. Memories of his father's stern lectures flickered through his mind. Warnings about letting emotions intrude, about maintaining absolute control. If only his father could see him now, choosing empathy and forging friendships in a world once deemed irrelevant to the Blackwood name. "It's strange, but I feel lighter," he admitted quietly, "as if all the armor I used to wear isn't necessary anymore." Olivia's expression softened. She wiped her hands on a cloth, then gestured for him to follow her into a smaller annex room. High shelves lined the walls, filled with neatly stacked canvases waiting to be displayed. In the center stood a table draped in white cloth. She pulled it back, revealing a painting carefully wrapped in brown paper. "I've been working on this," she said, carefully unwrapping a corner. "It's a piece about transformation, but also about grounding. I thought it might speak to what you've gone through." As she peeled away the paper, Alexander took in the half-finished artwork. It featured a silhouette of Manhattan's skyline against a dawn sky, with streaks of soft, hopeful color radiating outward. Subtle hints of Brooklyn's neighborhood, brick buildings, street murals, merged into the composition, illustrating two seemingly separate worlds blending into one harmonious landscape. She searched his face for a reaction. "I'd like this to be a gift to you when it's done, if you want it." He felt an unexpected tightness in his throat. "Thank you," he said, voice hushed. "It's beautiful." She wrapped the canvas again with tender care. "I hope it'll remind you that progress can be gentle as well as bold, that business and compassion don't have to be enemies." Their eyes met, a silent understanding passing between them. Not for the first time, Alexander felt overwhelmed by gratitude. The life he had meticulously constructed, rooted in power, prestige, and self-imposed distance, was still his, but now it had been infused with new meaning. Before he could speak further, a phone buzzed in his pocket. He excused himself, stepping into the hallway. It was Leonard, calling to confirm an upcoming interview with a national news outlet. There were more stories to be told, more angles to be explored, and for once, Alexander didn't dread the exposure. He saw it as an opportunity, a chance to share a narrative beyond mere numbers and profit margins. He ended the call, returning to the annex where Olivia waited. A smile formed on his lips as he realized that despite the whirlwind of responsibilities, he felt a steady flame of hope kindling inside him. The world he knew had not vanished. It had simply expanded to include this new realm of possibility, guided by a heart he'd long kept hidden. Now, as he looked at Olivia's unfinished painting, he recognized that both in art and in life, creation and transformation often went hand in hand. As weeks passed, the reverberations of the council's decision rippled through the city. Articles praising Blackwood Industries' role in preserving Brooklyn's cultural heartbeat popped up in local papers. A few national outlets ran features contrasting the company's philanthropic approach with Everline's ruthless expansion tactics. While most coverage was positive, some critics questioned whether Alexander's altruism would last, or if it was merely a savvy PR move. Back at the corporate headquarters in Manhattan, Alexander navigated a transformed environment. Employees approached him in hallways, more comfortable sharing their ideas or simply chatting about their personal passions. A handful even mentioned wanting to volunteer at the Brooklyn studio. He encouraged them, seeing an unexpected camaraderie forming within the company he once ran like a well-oiled but impersonal machine. At board meetings, the atmosphere had also shifted. The more conservative directors, once skeptical of any deviation from pure profit motives, found themselves open to new proposals. The pilot arts program now held a proven track record of positive media coverage and stakeholder goodwill. Though Janet Caldwell and others still prodded Alexander about maintaining a steady bottom line, there was less antagonism. Subtly, they recognized that this venture had not only avoided disaster, but brought a certain prestige to Blackwood Industries. After one particularly long board session, Alexander returned to his office. The late afternoon sun slanted through the glass walls, illuminating his polished desk and the large cityscape painting that hung behind it. He settled into the leather chair, exhaling. A sense of calm pervaded him, despite the endless stream of tasks waiting. As he stared at the painting, a commissioned work from years ago, his phone chimed. Glancing at the screen, he saw a message from his Aunt Helena, inviting him for a weekend visit. He realized how much time had slipped by since he last saw her in person. A small wave of guilt nudged him to accept. After all, she had been among the first to encourage him down this path of empathy and courage. The following weekend, he drove out to her Connecticut estate. Crisp winter air greeted him as he stepped from the car onto the gravel driveway. The house looked much as it always had, grand yet welcoming, with warm lights glowing in the windows. Helena appeared at the door, a mixture of fondness and curiosity on her face. Inside, they shared a meal in the cozy dining room. Conversation flowed from the success of the arts initiative to Helena's charitable interests. Over cups of herbal tea, she studied him with a discerning gaze. "You seem calmer these days," she observed, "as if the struggles you've faced also gave you some peace." He tapped a finger on the porcelain teacup's rim. "It's odd. I'm busier than ever, but it doesn't feel oppressive. I suppose I'm learning to delegate, to trust people, and not just with tasks, sometimes even with my own vulnerabilities." Helena's smile was tinged with pride. "That's quite an admission from the nephew, who once insisted he needed no one." He managed a light chuckle. "I had to lose a few battles with myself to realize that connection doesn't weaken you, it fortifies you, whether that's collaborating with local artists or just letting someone know you appreciate them." They continued chatting late into the evening. Helena recounted childhood memories of Alexander, painting a picture of a reserved boy with a keen intellect and a fierce drive to protect himself from any emotional harm. He listened with unusual openness, acknowledging how those early experiences shaped his worldview. By the time he retired to the guest room, he felt emotionally lighter, as though each reflection purged an old fear. In the morning, he took a solitary walk around the estate's grounds, recalling his father's presence that once loomed large here. Now, the air felt different. The old lessons about fortifying oneself against vulnerability didn't weigh as heavily. Perhaps love was a risk, but it was also a source of renewal. With each step, he felt more certain that bridging the gap between personal values and professional ambitions was not just possible, but necessary for a meaningful life. Upon returning to Manhattan the next day, he found an unexpected package waiting on his desk. It was from Olivia, a small canvas painting depicting a single blossoming flower in a crack of pavement. Her handwritten note read, "Sometimes beauty grows where we least expect it. Thank you for helping me see that." He traced a finger across the textured petals, a faint smile tugging at his lips. He placed the painting on a shelf near his desk, where he could easily glance at it amid his daily work. Each time his eyes fell on it, he was reminded that coming home, truly coming home, wasn't about escaping the city or leaving his empire behind. It was about allowing change to guide him, unveiling a world that had been right before his eyes all along. Over time, Alexander's transformation rippled beyond his immediate circle. Word spread that Blackwood Industries fostered an environment where employees could voice ideas for social impact projects. A new departmental unit, spearheaded by Leonard, began evaluating proposals for local partnerships. Everything from technology training in underprivileged schools to mentoring programs for budding entrepreneurs. While the main thrust of the company still revolved around global investments, the inclusion of these community-focused initiatives brought a fresh energy to the halls of Blackwood Industries. Alexander found himself fielding more queries from colleagues genuinely interested in bridging corporate strategy with public service. Janet Caldwell, once among the most skeptical board members, discreetly acknowledged the positive shift in employee morale during a private conversation. "You've changed the company, Alexander," she said, flipping through a folder of employee surveys, "and in turn, it might be changing you." He regarded her thoughtfully. "That's accurate, and I believe both changes are for the better." Outside the corporate sphere, the Brooklyn Arts District blossomed into a vibrant hub. With stable rents and official recognition, galleries expanded, cafes thrived, and street corners hosted spontaneous performances. Seeing the neighborhood flourish under the community trust arrangement gave Alexander a sense of pride that differed profoundly from sealing a multi-million-dollar deal. Here, success wasn't measured in market share, but in the intangible joy and cohesion of a community. One afternoon, Helena invited him to a small gathering of philanthropists and community leaders at a restored brownstone in Midtown. The event was casual yet purposeful. Dozens of people milling about, exchanging success stories and swapping ideas for further societal impact. Helena introduced Alexander to a few old friends, many of whom had heard rumors of his philanthropic pivot. As the evening wore on, a woman named Caroline, head of an educational non-profit, asked Alexander to speak informally to the group about what he'd learned. He hesitated, but ultimately obliged, stepping up to a small alcove where a makeshift microphone had been set. "Everyone here is dedicated to improving our world in some way," he began, voice steady but humble. "I used to think my primary responsibility was maximizing profits, and any deviation from that goal was wasted effort. But in working with Brooklyn's artists, I realized there's more to building an empire than chasing financial returns. True growth, personal or corporate, relies on nurturing the environment that sustains it." He caught Helena's approving nod from across the room. "Don't misunderstand me. Profitability matters," he continued. "But if success comes at the cost of displacing communities or stifling creativity, then what kind of future are we really building?" A soft murmur of agreement rose. He finished with a simple statement: "We can be stewards of opportunity, not just for shareholders, but for everyone touched by our businesses. It's not easy, and it often involves stepping into unfamiliar territory. But trust me, the rewards are immeasurable. A round of applause followed, modest yet heartfelt. Alexander returned to his seat, feeling both liberated and slightly vulnerable. This was the most candid he'd been about his philosophical shift in a public forum. Yet the crowd's reaction suggested he wasn't alone in believing commerce could blend with compassion. After the gathering, he slipped into a quieter room where vintage photographs of the city lined the walls. Helena joined him, her expression warm. "I couldn't be prouder," she said softly. "Your father wouldn't recognize you, yet I can't help but think this is closer to who you were meant to be." He exhaled, glancing at a black-and-white photograph of Times Square in the 1950s. "I wish he could see that strength can come from empathy, not just dominance. Maybe we all had to learn in our own ways." Helena's eyes glistened with understanding. "He had his battles, but you fought yours, and the victory is yours alone." They rejoined the main room, greeted by the buzz of clinking glasses and lively chatter. As people traded contact information and formed new alliances, Alexander saw a reflection of what he had accomplished in Brooklyn, individuals uniting for a cause greater than themselves. This synergy, once foreign to him, now felt like the heartbeat of everything worth preserving. After bidding farewell and promising to collaborate on future projects, he stepped out into the crisp evening air. Cars and pedestrians filled the busy Manhattan street, but for him, each passing face held more significance. Each person had a story, and perhaps a piece of that story could be elevated with the right support. The notion stirred a sense of responsibility within him, gently reminding him that he had emerged from his own shell and found a calling that transcended profit margins. Snow fell in soft drifts across Manhattan, blanketing the sidewalks with white. Christmas lights twinkled from store windows, illuminating the city in a festive glow. For Alexander, the season brought both a swirl of year-end business duties and a new sense of warmth he had never truly embraced before. He'd spent many holidays in the past immersed in strategy sessions or jetting off to negotiate contracts overseas. This year felt different. He stood at the window of his penthouse, gazing out at the snowy landscape. The hush of winter had a calming effect, muffling the usual honks and sirens. A sudden ring of the doorbell broke the silence. Alexander walked over, his footsteps echoing on polished floors. When he opened the door, Olivia stood there, cheeks flushed from the cold, a carefully wrapped package in her arms. She smiled, snowflakes melting into her red hair. "I know it's late, but I couldn't wait. I brought you something." He welcomed her in, helping her with her coat. She set the package on a nearby table. "Remember that painting I told you was meant for you?" she asked, eyes bright. "I've finished it." Carefully, she unwrapped the paper, revealing the piece she'd been working on for weeks. It depicted a sunrise over Manhattan, a skyline alive with possibility, and the hint of a flourishing arts district in the background. The sky brimmed with color, suggesting a dawn of renewed hope. A lump rose in Alexander's throat as he admired the detail. "It's exactly how I feel," he murmured, "like the city itself is getting a fresh start." Olivia's gaze flickered with emotion. "It's yours, then. Consider it a thank you gift for everything you've done. For the arts district, for me, for all of us who found our voices thanks to your willingness to listen." He rested a hand on the painting's edge, the brushstrokes almost palpable. "I never imagined I'd need to thank anyone for opening my eyes, but that's what you did for me," he said quietly. They settled in the living room, a gentle glow from a nearby lamp casting warmth over them. Outside, the snow continued drifting down. Olivia sipped a mug of hot chocolate he'd prepared, while Alexander reflected on the changes that had led him here. No longer did his home feel like a sterile showcase. It had become a space where meaningful conversations and genuine connections could occur. He glanced at her, memories of the first time they'd met flooding back, the frantic scramble to save her canvases in the pouring rain. If I hadn't stepped out that night, he mused aloud, so much might have remained the same for me. I never believed in fate, but I can't ignore how everything changed with that single encounter. She set her mug down, leaning closer. Neither can I. Sometimes the most unexpected moments steer our lives toward places we never knew we needed. Their eyes held each other's for a lingering heartbeat, a silent acknowledgement of how far they'd come, both individually and together. His mind flickered to Helena's unwavering support, to the community's rallying in Brooklyn, to the board's eventual acceptance of his vision. He realized that every piece of his old life still existed. He was still a powerful CEO, still possessed an empire, but it was now woven into something larger, more humane. As if reading his thoughts, Olivia touched his arm. "What do you want to do next? Beyond the arts district, I mean." He ran a hand over his chin, considering. "There are so many possibilities. Maybe expand the model to other neighborhoods, other cities, champion more social initiatives within Blackwood Industries. Eventually, I might even—" He paused, allowing a smile to form. "Take a proper vacation, one that isn't just a business trip, maybe with you if you'd like." She laughed softly. "I'd like that very much." They spent the next hour talking about grand ideas and simple joys, from future philanthropic projects to the possibility of traveling somewhere peaceful, maybe a small lakeside town or a tranquil stretch of coastline. With each new topic, Alexander felt the last remnants of his emotional armor dissolve. This was his life now, not just driving toward achievements but also nurturing relationships that gave those achievements meaning. Eventually, the clock chimed midnight. Olivia rose, preparing to head out into the gently falling snow. Before she reached the door, Alexander reached for her hand. "Stay a moment longer," he whispered, voice catching ever so slightly. They stood by the wide windows, watching the snowflakes dance. The city below sparkled under festive lights, as if celebrating its own transformation. A wave of emotion swelled in Alexander's chest, and he gathered Olivia in a tender embrace. A gentle hush enveloped them, the kind that only a snowy night in a vibrant city can provide. In that embrace, he felt his heart reclaim a vitality he once believed was lost to ambition and isolation. Though challenges would continue and uncertainties lay ahead, he recognized that he no longer walked alone. With the city as their witness and the soft glow of hope radiating like dawn, he held Olivia close, quietly grateful for a second chance at life and love he never saw coming. He closed his eyes, inhaling the sweet mix of cocoa and paint lingering on her clothes, letting the warmth of human connection guide him forward into a future where he could be both the man he had been and the man he was becoming, all in the same breath. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.